What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto calls Minato useless? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. Naruto woke suddenly, as most shinobi tended to, though his body didn't otherwise react to his quick conscious shift into wakefulness. He breathed evenly, deeply, as if he was still asleep, listening for the sound or motion that had woken him with such suddenness. The area was quiet with the sound of the wind through leaves, and the distinct absence of birdsong, that made the distant sounds of destruction echo through the trees. Naruto's eyes opened suddenly, seeing the branches of the tall Konoha trees above him. The forest was cast in shadow, like late evening. There was a wide swath of uprooted trees and trenches of dirt around him. Naruto sat up and groaned as his body protested the movement. He felt slow and worn out, and struggled to feel his own chakra weakly pulsing beneath his skin. Pushing a few stray branches off of him, Naruto got to his feet, feeling drained and weak. He looked over himself, looking for unfelt wounds. His clothes were ragged, one dark pant leg tattered at the ends, the other still tucked into the bindings around his calves. His shirt sleeves were dirty and one of the swirled patches on his arms had been torn, and his black and orange coat had deep gashes across his chest, leaving it flapping in the breeze. He was a bit worse for wear and he knew he looked like he just came out of the bad end of a good fight, but he wasn't wounded. At least not anymore. What happened? He thought, taking in the surrounding area. He knew the location, though he barely recognized it with the uprooted trees. It was one of Konoha's outside training grounds, one of the furthest from the village's walls. He could see the top edge of the Hokage monument in the distance through the trees. Battle sounds echoed through the trees again and Naruto scaled a tree, trying to figure out the direction of the sounds. He perched on a high branch, taking in the view of the village and its walls and the mountain beside it. The sun was low over the horizon, casting long shadows. He turned and stared, motionless in shock. Crouched low over the forest in the distance stood the Kyuubi, its 9 tails sweeping in great arcs over its body. Naruto could hear its growls and calls vibrating through the trees. He couldn't believe his eyes. The Kyuubi was supposed to be sealed within him, not loose to wreak havoc on Konoha again. Naruto stared at the sight. He could barely make out the shapes of shinobi attempting to battle it, desperately trying to turn it away from its path towards the hidden village. Shock and anger and confusion swirled through him and he suddenly felt something that made his anger disappear in an instant and feed his confusion twice-fold. The Kyuubi's chakra was not inside of him. Naruto frantically looked down at his stomach, pulling his shirt up to stare at his bare stomach. He could see faint traces of the once there seals, the lines faded like old scars. The Kyuubi was not sealed within him like it should have been. Its absence sent Naruto reeling, and not just from the shock, but from the sudden realization of the feeling of emptiness. A great expanse of himself that had once been full to bursting with barely restrained power and rage was no longer there. What the hell? He whispered, staring back at the sight before him. The 9-tailed fox swung its tails violently, toppling a great swath of trees and sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. How did it get out? Impossible, Naruto thought, still too shocked to really react. What the hell happened? Flashes of memory surfaced slowly, then more rapidly as he racked his brain for some explanation to what was going on and he wondered if he was dead. I should be dead. Scenes of Konoha's distant training grounds in ruins, black flames, a swirled mask and a taunting voice echoed through his head. Madara, Uchiha Madara and the bastard's annoying timejutsus, 1. Which made a battle with the guy aggravating enough to pull out the 9-tails chakra so early, too early. Naruto didn't have the strength otherwise to face him, or the speed. But he also remembered, vaguely through the haze that was his mind behind the Kyuubi's shroud and tails, that Madara had found him terribly annoying in return. Enough to do something about it. Something that Naruto had no idea was possible, but Madara had calmly stood before him and told him exactly what he was going to do, and when. Naruto knew where he thought he was, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Naruto twisted his head back around to look at the village. His eyes immediately went to the monument, the faces of the Hokages carved in stone above the village. There were only 4. Naruto felt his eyes widen at the sight. The 5th's face was not there, leaving the space it had. Would take a rough, uneven lump of cliff and stone. Naruto's eyes slowly tracked back to the Kyuubi raging in the distance as his mind was locked in a state between absolute numbness and complete chaos. He had traveled back in time. Madara, he growled, watching the fox in the distance with growing anger. He looked around him, trying to find the man responsible for his situation. He couldn't sense him anywhere, but that didn't mean he wasn't near. Naruto looked back to the village, wondering where the man would head to first. Naruto wasn't sure, he couldn't predict the Uchiha. Kushina, Naruto whispered, suddenly remembering. Madara was going to go after his infant self and his mother, killing the child before the fox could be sealed. Naruto looked around again, wondering where he would find her. He didn't know where she had lived, or how she had died this night. He could scour the entire village and miss her. The fox in the distance took down another swatch of forest, growling into the darkening sky. Naruto could see its eyes glowing slightly, reflecting the sinking light of the sun. He could feel the malice and anger of the fox's nature from his distance, rolling over and through the forest in near tangible waves of power and rage and killing intent so potent that it took his breath away. As he watched, suddenly a large summoning grew out of the depths of the forest. Naruto felt his eyes widen at the sight of Gamabunta, the boss toad, standing between the rampaging nine-tailed fox and the village's walls. Atop the toad's head stood the tall figure of a man. Naruto knew who he was. Even from his distance, he could see the features of the fourth Hokage staring down the visage of the angry fox. The nine tails screamed its fury, slashing its clawed hands toward the toad. Gamabunta hopped out of the way, drawing his blade and spitting out great balls of water bombs. The water struck the fox harshly, exploding in great waves of chakra and water. The fox screamed again, but didn't retaliate. Instead, it jumped back away from the boss toad. Naruto stared, shocked again as the fox retreated, still screaming and growling in anger and rage as it distanced itself from the toad and the village. "Why is it retreating? That's not right," Naruto said, standing as he watched the fox's retreat. "What's going on?" Gamabunta and the fourth didn't follow far, keeping close to the village's surrounding forest. Naruto watched as the fox screamed one last time before disappearing in a splash of chakra and smoke. It had left. What the hell? Naruto looked around the area again, wondering if it had just changed locations to attack from a new direction. But he couldn't even feel the lingering traces of the nine tails' chakra in the area. It had completely left, as if it had been unsummoned. Naruto blinked. "Madara!" Naruto growled, and jumped from his perch, propelling himself forward through the trees, keeping Gamabunta and the fourth Hokage on his head in his sights. He had to warn him. He cringed as his muscles ached at the forced motion. He wouldn't be able to do much, his body was too worn out and tired. "Damn Madara," he snarled to himself, "he actually wore me out. Forced me to use the stupid fox's chakra. I don't even have the strength to activate my bloodline limit." It was unusual that Naruto's stamina gave out enough that he didn't have the strength to hold onto the low chakra-consuming bloodline limit. He wondered if his severe weariness had anything to do with the time jump, the sudden lack of the Kyuubi, or if Madara was actually that difficult. Naruto wasn't sure. He didn't remember much of the last bit of his battle with Madara before he woke up. He recalled only Madara's threat and his own reaction, releasing the sixth tail of the Kyuubi sealed within him. He had never done so before. He honestly hadn't thought he would survive it. Naruto closed the distance to the fourth quickly, racing through the trees and dodging a couple shinobi. The fourth was looking away from him, addressing a team of shinobi perched in the trees near him, gesturing towards the swath of destruction left by the fox. Naruto jumped high into the trees and launched himself into the air over Gamabunta's back. The fourth turned towards him, a kunai in his hand and his coat flapping around him. Naruto landed a few paces away, crouched in his landing. He felt the boss toad shift and move enter him, grumbling. Who is that?" Gamabunta said, his voice vibrating threateningly through Naruto's feet. The fourth watched him carefully, his eyes narrowed. Naruto watched him in return, not moving as he stared at the man. He had spent a lifetime looking up at this man's face carved in stone, claiming his greatness and dreams to surpass the great Namikaze Minato, the man who had sealed the nine-tailed beast within him, his own son. The fourth watched him, his eyes narrowed slightly. Naruto remained still, letting the man look him over, trying not to look like he had just impertinently perched himself atop the toad boss's head in order to attack the Hokage. He would be lucky if Gamabunta didn't swallow him whole for his audacity alone. Who are you? The fourth asked, his voice steady and even and laced with threat. Naruto blinked and stood slowly. Naruto didn't respond right away, knowing that by his silence he was letting the fourth know that he was about to say something untruthful, or in the least, not the whole truth. Naruto wanted him to know he was going to give him a false name. Kodora, Naruto said, watching as the fourth's eyes narrowed slightly. Naruto didn't want to lie to him, but he wasn't sure if he should reveal who he really was or not. On one hand, he was sure there were rules regarding the whole time travel process. Rules that had to do with not messing up the timeline and creating things like paradoxes. Hokage-sama, one of the shinobi in the nearby trees said, gaining their attention. Sato, Minato said, turning slightly to them, make sure the wounded get to the hospital for treatment, set up a secondary defense barrier in a perimeter around the village and make sure there is a rotating guard on all the walls. If the Kyuubi is sighted again, notify me immediately. Hi, too, Hokage-sama, Sato called and shot off into the forest, taking his team with him. Naruto glanced at them as they left before turning his eyes back to the man across from him. They had been left mostly alone, and Naruto knew that there was no longer anyone close enough to hear their words except for the toad beneath their feet. Small tiger? The fourth asked, translating the name with a slight raise of a brow. Naruto felt a mixing of aggravation and long-suffering amusement at the name, and he let it show. A name a friend gave to me, Naruto said, seeing Sai's face in his mind. When someone said that I fight as if I was a caged tiger. He found it amusing and called me small tiger because of my, well, he thought it was funny anyways. It stuck, regrettably. The fourth didn't respond, but Naruto thought he saw some amusement in the man's subtle shift of expression. Naruto pondered his unique position again, weighing the pros and cons of what and how much to say to the man in front of him. He knew that the fourth had no reason to trust him, but Naruto didn't have the time nor energy to deal with Madara on his own. He needed the Yondaime's help. Naruto decided to throw caution to the wind. His more reckless, insane plans tended to work better anyways. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, he said. The fourth's eyes widened then narrowed, crouching slightly into a more ready stance. Naruto shifted a foot backwards before stopping himself. Look, it's a long story, but I'm not here to fight you. Naruto said, I'm here to warn you. Kushina's in danger. The guy who summoned the fox is here to kill her son before you get the chance to seal the Kyuubi inside of him. He's going to kill her. Where is she? Who is going to kill her? Minato asked darkly. Naruto sucked in a breath. Uchiha Madara. Madara? Yes, look, I know it sounds crazy, but he's got some crazy time jutsu thing and he's come back here to kill her and meh. Naruto stopped and rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. He's come back here? Minato asked, standing straight again. Exactly what do you mean? He came from the future. Naruto said. Well, so did I. But that's besides the point. He came back too. You're from the future? Naruto stared at him, not sure if Minato was taking him seriously or if he was trying to decide if he had a crazy person on his hands. Naruto wasn't too sure himself. The whole situation was crazy and he barely believed it himself. He had no idea that jumping through time was even possible to a small scale until he had faced Madara for the first time. Then Kakashi had tried to explain the fourth's use of time and space jutsus, which had just confused him for ages. But Naruto had seen Madara's space and time jutsus firsthand, had tried to fight against him and failed, though even then, Naruto had a hard time believing that he had traveled nearly 2 decades into the past. Naruto sucked in a deep breath. Madara can manipulate time with some sort of jutsu that I can't explain and just confuses the hell out of me. But he does it and it's annoying and he managed to drag me along, though. Naruto paused. I wonder if he realizes I got dragged along with him. Naruto shook his head. Anyways, he's here to get rid of me before I get annoying, he said. So he's going to. He stopped again, looking back into the bright blue eyes of his father. Minato was watching him with a blank look, hiding any of his thoughts or emotions. Naruto wasn't sure what else to say to the man. He didn't think they had a lot of time. Kushina and his infant self were in serious danger and Naruto was pretty sure that Madara wouldn't just fiddle around and going after them. Why did he call off the Kyuubi from attacking Konoha? Naruto wondered, looking back to the destruction that the fox had left in its wake. Oh, Naruto said, turning his attention back to the man across from him. That's it. Naruto took a few steps forward, pulling up his shirt to bare his stomach. Minato watched him carefully, not moving to either raise his weapon or keep the distance between them. Minato's eyes flickered down to his abdomen and widened slightly. Naruto held the hem of his shirt up so the fourth could see the faint, scarring traces of the seals that once held the Kyuubi within him. Even if the Kyuubi was gone, and the seals were barren, they could still be seen. Naruto knew that the fourth would recognize his own work, even if they were now dead seals, and the man would know what they had been created for. It used to house the Kyuubi. Naruto said, I don't know what happened to it, when I woke up here. Now, it was gone, but the seals are still there. Minato remained silent, his blue eyes piercing as he looked into Naruto's own. Naruto had no idea what he was thinking, but he felt only minimal amounts of threat from the man. He seemed to be more curious than threatened, for which Naruto was grateful, but they still didn't have a lot of time. It's a long story, but we don't have time for it right now. Naruto said, holding his father's blue gaze. Madara is going after mom. Now. Hey, Minato, Gamabunta said. Naruto shifted as the toad's voice vibrated through his feet, looking down over the edge of his head. Gamabunta moved, sheathing his sword and pulling his long pipe out of his clothing. Who is this kid, Minato looked at Naruto before turning his attention to the toad below him. Gamabunta, Minato said, can you take us to the village? The toad said, puffing on his pipe. I'm pretty big, you sure you want me to get that close? Just jump in that direction and we'll jump off when we're close. Minato said. Well, alright, Gamabunta said, but I want an explanation later. I don't just let anyone sit on my head, Minato. Hey boss, Naruto called, grinning and rapping on the toad's head with his foot. The toad moved under him, and the two rode the motions out. Minato raised an eyebrow at him, but said nothing. Boss, is it? Gamabunta said. Naruto could see the toad's eyes rolling to look up at them. The toad chuckled, the sound and motion rolling under their feet. Ha, ha ha. Minato, I like this kid. I could use another subordinate. Alright, then, kid. I'll give you a chance to prove yourself to be my subordinate. Naruto scowled and crossed his arms, grumbling under his breath about ungrateful toad bosses. What was that, kid? The toad said, his pipe letting out a puff of smoke. I said I ain't doing that again. Naruto said. Once was enough for me. Ooh? Gamabunta said, his eyes rolling again as he pulled on his pipe. Gamabunta, Minato said, we are short on time. Very well. The toad said. Hang on then. Naruto staggered his feet as the toad shifted below him, noticing Minato barely moving at Gamabunta's motions. Gamabunta crouched low, folding his legs under him, and Naruto braced himself for the force of the toad's impending jump. A second later the toad jumped. Naruto sucked in a sharp breath at the jump, forced to crouch low atop the toad's head as they soared over the short span of forest towards the village. Just before the toad would have landed atop the walls and nearby buildings, Gamabunta disappeared in a puff of smoke with an echoing, "Call me later, Minato." Naruto stumbled at the sudden lack of support under his feet before somersaulting in the air and landing only slightly awkward atop the edge of a roof. Looking around he spotted Minato not far, balanced on the peak of the roofline above him. This way, Minato said, jumping to the next roof. Naruto followed, their speed picking up quickly as Minato gauged Naruto's ability to keep pace. They crossed half the village and Naruto followed him down into the street outside of the hospital. Minato looked at him again, his blue eyes piercing as Naruto forced himself not to shift or fidget. Naruto wasn't sure what the other man was thinking, but a moment later Minato turned and headed towards the doors. Naruto followed him silently. Rin fidgeted slightly, her eyes looking over Kushina's sweat-drenched body in a mixture of concern and support. She rinsed a wet rag in the bowl of cold water next to her before using it to wipe the woman's face. Kushina breathed quickly but deeply and gave her a smile. He sure is impatient, Rin-chan, she said. Rin smiled. He'll be strong, I'm sure. Of course he will be. The nurse across from her said. The woman fussed a bit with the bedding, her old hands sure and precise in their movements. Kushina nodded, her body sinking into the sheets around her. Her contractions were growing more intense and closer together. Rin knew that the baby would be birthed soon, within hours, likely. He was already 2 weeks early, and Kushina's labor pains were increasing fast. If only it was any other day. Rin glanced out of window, but saw nothing but the village and the darkening sky above it. It seemed peaceful, too much so. The Nine Tails was making its way to Konoha, and the Hokage had been forced to choose between being there for the birth of his son, or facing down the Kyuubi. Rin knew that her sensei would give his life for the village, but she did wish that he could have been there for Kushina, not that either of the girls would begrudge the man his choice. He was the Hokage after all, and it was his nature to put others before himself, and his village before anything else. Kushina cried out again, and Rin turned at the sound, watching the wave of pain pass through the pregnant woman's body. She reached out and brushed Kushina's hair to the side, and made a soothing sound in her throat. A moment later the contraction passed and Kushina sagged back to the bed. "Just breathe, dear," the nurse said. Kushina cracked one eye open to give the woman a tired glare, but it went ignored. Rin smiled slightly and patted Kushina's hand. "Oh good," a dark voice said from the window, "I'm not late." Rin spun at the sound and sucked in a breath at the sight of a darkly dressed man perched on the widow's sill. He wore an orange, spiraled mask that was cracked, revealing his eyes and a part of his left cheek. The man slipped to the floor with barely a sound, his red eyes, his Sharingan eyes, fixed on the pregnant woman lying on the bed. Rin could barely move. The man sent out a steady wall of killer intent that caused the air to freeze in her lungs. She couldn't even breathe as she stared in shock and horror at the man. Who are you?" Kushina ground out. "Me?" the man said, "It's not important, I'm afraid." Kushina grunted as another contraction hit her and Rin wished that she could move to comfort her, but the terror and intensity in the air had frozen her to the spot. All she could do was stare at the Sharingan eyes of the man as he slowly took a few steps forward, his hand raising towards them. "What do you want?" Kushina asked, her voice strained. The man glanced at her. "You and that child within you dead." Something flickered and Rin heard a sharp gasp and pained gurgle from behind her. She finally found the strength to move and looked behind her to see the nurse clutching her throat and staggering backwards. Blood streamed down from behind her hands and the old woman stumbled awkwardly against the wall. Rin watched in growing horror as she slid down the wall, her eyes glassing over. Rin had fought in a war. She had killed and healed and seen many of the horrible things that shinobi could do to each other, but she had never felt anything like the solid darkness of killing intent the man gave off. She hadn't even seen him move. She had no idea what he had done to kill the nurse so quickly. Rin's eyes slowly tracked back to the man to find the Sharingan staring back at her. His expression was bored and uninterested, but the three tomos twirled lazily as he focused on her. She knew that she was next, and she wasn't sure there was anything she could do about it. Rin screamed, some part of her desperately hoping that someone would hear and come running to help. They traversed the halls with little delay, Minato greeting a few of those they passed. Naruto took in the minor disorder of the main lobby, wondering how many shinobi had been injured or killed from the short attack by the fox. He wondered, then, how many hadn't been killed since the nine-tailed fox had retreated before it reached the walls of the village. A distant scream echoed down the halls and was suddenly muffled. Minato seemed to stop in mid-step, frozen for a moment before disappearing, his form flickering down the hall in his speed. Naruto blinked once and chased after him, his body protesting and barely able to keep up with the man's incredible speed. He saw him flicker around a corner at the end of the hall and out of sight, and Naruto tried to pull more speed out of his limbs to follow him. He dashed down the hallway and skidded around the corner, crashing into the wall opposite in his wild attempt to change directions in a dead sprint on a slick floor. His heavily drained reserves of chakra flared at the motion, aiding his movements as he charged down the new hallway, spotting a door hanging from its hinges ahead of him. Another pained shout echoed down the hall, and Naruto skidded across the opening of the door, grabbing onto the frame in order to stop. The small hospital room was a bit crowded. A woman was laying on the bed, bloodied, a girl standing over her with chakra laced through her fingers. A woman was slumped against the wall nearby, her eyes staring off and blood coating her chest from her throat. Minato stood between the girls and a darkly dressed man whom Naruto recognized immediately. "Madara," Naruto snarled, feeling the sensation of fury that was oddly cold without the fox's fiery heat to push it. Madara turned sharply at his voice, his Sharingan eyes widening slightly. Madara hissed, "What the hell are you doing here? Came along for the ride." Naruto said, crouching slightly with his hands on the doorframe to either side of him to hold himself up. "What, you didn't realize you had a passenger? You are more trouble than you're worth, Jinchuriki," Madara said, sneering at him. Naruto growled, the sound rumbling deep in his throat like it had when the Kyuubi's fury had leaked into his own, even though he knew that the fox's chakra and emotions were no longer within him. He tensed, then shot forward, barreling himself towards Madara. Madara's form flickered slightly, shifting to the side out of Naruto's path. Naruto snarled, and he saw Minato kick out sharply, hitting Madara in the side and sending the man back into Naruto's line of attack. Naruto tackled him, wrapping his arms around the man and digging his shoulder into his gut as the force of their movement took them both through the wall. Naruto didn't release the man, digging his clawed hands into Madara's collar as they crashed to the pavement below. They rolled, Naruto holding the man to prevent him from flickering away, and dragged him to his feet, pulling a kunai from his pouch. Madara blocked it with his own, the weapon sparking at the contact. Madara shot out his free hand and wrapped it around Naruto's neck. Naruto didn't release him, grunting at the force constricting around his throat and slowly cutting off his air. "You have proved to be a thorn in my side, Jinchuriki," Madara said, tightening his hold. Naruto ignored his body's need to gag, snarling silently at the man and letting his chakra flare around them. He didn't have much left, yet it swirled around him in harsh currents of wind that cut into both of their skin and clothes. "This village is mine," Madara whispered with a sneer. Naruto growled low in his throat despite the hand cutting off his ability to breathe. "I won't let you," he said, struggling to get the words out. Madara chuckled darkly, squeezing his hand tighter around his neck. Naruto gagged slightly and tried to suck in a breath that couldn't make it through to his lungs. "You've already failed, Jinchuriki," Madara said with a smirk. Naruto felt his eyes widen, and he glanced past the man to the gaping hole they had left in the side of the hospital building. Had Madara already killed her? Had he been too late? He saw Minato standing in the hole, a three-pronged kunai in one hand with a growing Rasengan in the palm of the other. An expression of dark, sharp fury was etched onto his face as his eyes glowed with an icy fire, and Naruto had the fleeting thought that the man was unexpectedly, coldly vicious. "I'll kill you," Naruto snarled, turning his attention back to the man in his grasp, tightening his hold on the man's clothing and twisting the kunai in his other hand. The two blades hissed against each other as Naruto turned it and plunged it deep into the man's shoulder. Madara sucked in a sharp breath and returned the attack. Naruto was unable to block it, turning his body in the limited range of motion he had and took the kunai attack in his ribs, feeling the blade plunge deep. Naruto gasped, feeling the much-needed air rush into his lungs before Madara's hand tightened its hold on his neck again. Naruto didn't let go of him as Minato's three-pronged kunai sailed through the air. Madara lurched as it lodged itself in his back. Naruto winced as the hand on his throat constricted painfully. A second later Minato appeared behind Madara with a flash of yellow light, the Rasengan already being pushed towards Madara's back. With a sudden closeness, Naruto could see flecks of cold throughout the icy blue of the fourth's eyes. Madara narrowed his eyes, the Sharingan spinning dangerously as he twisted his body, pulling on Naruto to try to avoid the fourth's attack. Naruto planted his feet, flaring what was left of his chakra and pulling sharply on the kunai embedded in the man's shoulder, forcing Madara to take the fourth's Rasengan directly in his back. Naruto saw the flare of the Rasengan's attack from the corner of his eyes as he met the spinning tomos of Madara's Sharingan. The world around him melted like wax, the sky dripping onto the buildings and flowing to the ground, leaving behind a vast, unending horizon of blood-red and swirling black clouds filled with dark lightning. Naruto sucked in a breath, staring around him at the illusionary world. The melted wax flowed to him, surrounding his feet and legs and crawling up his legs like many hands. Familiar faces and bodies formed from it, rising around him with angry looks and weapons in hand, his friends and teammates, and those of the village who he had befriended. Naruto knew that it was an illusion. He knew that none of it was real and that it was all created by the tortuous illusions of Madara's Sharingan, but it felt real. Naruto couldn't move as the cold, waxy substance of the world wound around his limbs, holding him in place as the figures around him raised their weapons and blades to him. Naruto cringed and steeled himself as the blades stabbed towards him, the metal slicing through his body with a wet hiss. Naruto bit through his lip and cried out, throwing his head back as he screamed. The blades retreated, pulled from his body, and Naruto felt himself sag in his bonds. He lifted his head enough to see the figures around him raise their blades again, the sharp edges of the swords and knives glinting in the eerie red light as they plunged towards him. The looks of hatred and disgust and cold indifference bit deeply into his heart as the faces of those he loved wielded weapons both physical and emotional. Naruto gritted his teeth against the pain, trying not to scream as the scene replayed itself over and over again. He clenched his eyes shut to block out the faces of those he loved and those he called friends as they stabbed him. He tried to remind himself that it was all just an illusion, that it wasn't real. But it felt real, and he was struggling to endure the hours as he lost track of time and of reality. The world melted again, swirling around and away from him like thick smoke or oil on water. Naruto staggered as he took in the sight of the hospital before him. He sucked in a sharp breath, feeling like his throat was raw and torn. He looked around, noticing that he was crouched low to the ground, his hands still fisted in Madara's clothing. The man was heavy in his grasp, dead weight. "Are you all right?" Minato asked, leaning over him. Naruto looked up at the man, then back to Madara, nodding slightly and feeling his balance tip at the motion. "Yeah, I'm fine," Naruto said as the world tipped sideways. He blinked up at the sky, seeing Minato's face enter his narrowing field of vision. The man's mouth moved and Naruto heard sound, but couldn't understand the words. Slowly his vision blackened and he fell into unconsciousness. Naruto woke to the soft sounds of the village and the afternoon light streaming onto his face. The room around him was silent and still, and he could hear the distant muffled sounds of the Konoha streets drifting through the window. It smelled like the hospital. Naruto suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the whitewashed ceiling above him. He was in the hospital. He would know that ceiling anywhere. He felt inward, looking for his chakra, and found it simmering lowly within him, traversing under his skin and through his muscles steadily, if a little sluggishly. He looked deeper and found the emptiness that the fox's absence had left, like some dark, black hole in the back of his mind and soul. His chakra otherwise seemed unaffected by the Kyuubi's absence, which comforted him somewhat, though he wondered what sort of changes he could expect. He sighed and squeezed his eyes shut, shifting his fingers on one hand to form a simple seal. "Hakinkage," his whispered. His chakras swirled within him and settled into a swifter pattern, and he opened his eyes again. He knew that his eyes were now a different color, no longer the bright blue of his birth. They now reflected the golden color of his hair, a testament to the activation of his bloodline limit. He took a deep breath, holding it for a moment as he felt the subtle shifts of the Kekkai Genkei 3 on his body. It would help him to heal a little faster. Naruto glanced around and sat up. Or rather, he tried to. He got far enough to pull his shoulders off the bed before his muscles spasmed and he fell back to the sheets with a resounding, "Ow! Ow! Ow!" He curled around himself, throwing an arm or two out in retaliation to his body's stiff pains. His shouts and motions drew the attention of the medics in the hallway, and two white-hooded medic nin came through the door, startling Naruto at their sudden entrance. He jumped off the bed to face them despite the pain. The sheets tangled around his legs from his thrashing and he crashed to the floor with a thud. Naruto heaved a deep sigh and watched the relatively harmless medic nins from his sprawled, undignified position on the floor next to his bed. He groaned out. It had been a while since the opening of a door had startled him enough to send him sprawling to the ground tangled in his own bed sheets. "Ow!" he grumbled, pushing himself off his face. His body protested the motion, but it wasn't as painful as it had been when he first tried to move. There was nothing like a good dumping to the floor to do a recently healing body good. "You shouldn't be out of bed," one of the medics chastised. Naruto ignored the comment, allowing the man to help him to his feet and disentangle the rogue bed sheets from his legs. As soon as he was on his feet, he pulled his arm back from the man and stood on his own, glancing around the room before settling on the one medic nin still left in the room. "What happened?" Naruto asked. "You don't remember?" the medic nin asked. Naruto thought about that, recalling his recent memories of the battle against Madara, the subsequent time travel and his short fight with Madara with Minato's help. "Is he dead?" Naruto asked. "Who? Madara? I don't know who Madara is." the medic Nin said as he tried to fix the bedsheets. The intruder though was killed by the Hokage, though I think you helped in that, yes? Naruto shrugged as he watched the medic straighten the bedding. So he's dead, then. The Hokage took care of the body. The medic Nin said. And he said that he wanted to talk to you when you woke up. How long have I been out of it? Naruto asked, watching the medic retreat to stand between him and the door. 8 days. 8. Naruto looked around the room. That was unusual. Where are my clothes? They were thrown out. The medic Nin said, they were beyond repair. What is left is there. He pointed to a small table near the bed. Naruto looked over the small pile of belongings before turning back to the other man with a slightly wild look. What am I supposed to wear if you threw away my clothes? The medic Nin looked at him sharply. You can't leave yet. You just woke up. Sure I can. Naruto said with a small grin, I'm fine. You've been asleep for the past 8 days. Do you have any idea how bad your wounds were? Naruto shrugged nonchalantly. Don't remember. He said without bothering to hide that it was a lie. Truth was he wasn't sure. He was relatively unharmed when he woke up in the past, but his chakra levels were at the state of near exhaustion. Naruto remembered the kunai getting stabbed into his chest, and he remembered Madara trying to crush his throat, but he had no idea the side effects of Madara's Sharingan-fueled illusions and torture. The Tsukuyomi 3 attack could be psychologically devastating, but otherwise he didn't know what damages it caused. Naruto stood and stretched, feeling his muscles pulled tightly at the action. He was sore and stiff, but he'd been worse. He looked over the table again. It held a handful of kunai and shuriken, his necklace, a couple sealed scrolls, a tool pouch and his sandals. His Hite 8 was sitting atop the pile. A folded stack of standard ninja dress, pants and shirt with a roll of tape, sat next to his personal effects. Naruto heaved a sigh and plopped back on the bed, ruffling the sheets under him again. The medic Nin gave him a look, which Naruto ignored. He grabbed for his necklace, slipping the cord over his head, and following the motion with his Hite 8. He wrapped the forehead protector around his head, feeling better with the comfortable weight of it above his eyes. Sir, you cannot leave yet. The medic Nin said, watching him with a frown. Course I can. Naruto quipped. The Hokage specifically requested that you not leave. Naruto gave the man a look that clearly told the medic how much sanity Naruto thought the man had. The medic glowered down at him, crossing his arms over his chest. Naruto snarled silently at him, grabbing the tool pouch from the table and shoving the loose kunai and shuriken into its depths. The Hokage wants to speak with you. The medic Nin tried again as Naruto stood in order to pull on the pants over the shorts he wore. Not his normal color, but the dull navy would do until he could find something more suitable to his tastes. Yeah, Naruto said, grabbing the roll of bandages to wrap his feet and legs, tucking the hem of the pants into the top of the wraps. He slipped on his sandals and tore off a short strip of the bandage wrap, twisting it into a thin rope. He glowered back at the medic Nin, matching the man look for look as he pulled his hair into a tail behind his head, tying it with the strip of bandage. He felt the tips of the ponytail brush against his shoulder blades. He had no intention of remaining in the hospital as far as he could help it. Naruto stretched again as he picked up the long-sleeved shirt from the table, complete with the swirled marks on the sleeves and back. He felt better. His muscles weren't trying to seizure at his every movement, a further testament to his healing abilities despite the distinct lack of kyubi. Naruto tied his Hite 8 around his head before turning towards the door only to find the medic Nin standing in his path. Oi, Naruto said, I'm outta here. The medic Nin moved his hands to his hips, looking down his nose at Naruto, though he wasn't much taller than the blonde. Naruto stuck his chin out and glared back up at him. Their staring contest was interrupted by the door opening again, the second medic Nin leading in a blonde shinobi, both looking at the two in the room with interest. Naruto glanced at the two newcomers and returned his eyes to the medic Nin standing in front of him, before feeling his eyes widen and shoot back to the shinobi standing just inside the doorway. Naruto stared at the other blonde, recognizing the man's face immediately. He had wondered if he had been dreaming. He was pretty sure he wasn't anymore. The fourth Hokage looked back at him before motioning for the two medic Nin to leave. Naruto barely noticed as the door closed behind them. How are you feeling? The fourth asked as Naruto sunk back to sit on the bed. Never better. Naruto quipped, then smiled a bit sheepishly as the fourth's eyebrow rose. I'm fine. Minato stood and watched him silently, and Naruto held his tongue under the scrutiny, watching the man in return. He hadn't really thought about it before, but he was now in the same room with his father. His father, alive and breathing and inspecting him with narrowed, calculating eyes. You have the Hokage, the fourth said, and Naruto felt his eyes widen slightly in surprise. It was rare for anyone to recognize it. It had been generations since someone had been able to activate it. Kakashi had told Naruto that the fourth had begun the process and would have likely activated the bloodline limit had he not died when he did. Naruto hadn't thought that the fourth would recognize it. He hadn't thought about it at all, actually. He should have known better. Of course the fourth would recognize the sign of the activated Kekkei Genkai from his own family. Yes, Naruto said. I activated it a couple years ago. Kakashi-sensei told me about it and helped me to find a way to activate it. Or rather, he helped me to see if I even had the ability to do so. Minato looked at him a moment longer before nodding, his features softening a bit at the motion. He dug into a pocket of his coat and pulled out a scrap of orange material, which he threw towards him. Naruto caught it, looking at it questioningly. It was a scarf, he saw, mostly orange with stripes of red and yellow at its ends. You should cover your face. Minato said. You look far too much like me not to raise questions. Naruto blinked and looked back at the face of his father. He supposed that they did look an awful lot alike. He hadn't really thought about it before. He had been told, but he hadn't ever considered it. Naruto nodded and stretched the scarf out in his hands. He wrapped it around his nose and chin, twisting it once as he pulled it back, and tied it in a knot behind his neck below his ponytail, letting the long ends of it stream down his back. He shifted it over his nose with his hand. It was a strange feeling to cover his face. He pictured Kakashi's mask and smiled. Good, Minato said, getting his attention again. And you'll go by a codename. A codename? Naruto asked, his voice only slightly muffled by the thin fabric over his face. Minato nodded. Yes, you will not tell anyone who you are or where you came from. You will especially not inform others of the time travel. If you think you ought to do so, you will ask for my permission first. Naruto narrowed his eyes. I will insist on informing a couple people. Who? The third, Jiraiya, and later on, Tsunade and Kakashi. If the fourth was surprised by his list, he didn't show it, merely nodding once after a moment of thought. That is acceptable. I would like to be present when you do so if it is possible. Naruto shrugged. Sure. Why am I hiding my identity anyways? Minato looked at him a moment. Because of the time difference for one. Because I have more enemies than is particularly healthy and most of them would mistake you for me, or would take you simply because they had a decent look-alike for a target. Because you are not on the Konoha ninja registry yet even though you wear a Hite aid and are clearly a trained shinobi. And because while it's not common knowledge, it's no secret that Kushina is an Uzumaki and was going to name her son Naruto. Naruto blinked and nodded, not really having anything to say in response to any of his reasons. They all made sense and Naruto didn't really mind hiding his face and going under a codename. It had a sneaky aspect that gratified the prankster in him. He had never had the need to hide his identity or sneak around really before. It usually ended up being a moot point anyways. He was just too recognizable. But now, here, no one knew him. Few even knew of him. From now on you are Kinatsu. The fourth said. Naruto tilted his head slightly, thinking about the name. Kinatsu. Naruto said, trying it out. I like it. Minato nodded. Your file will be placed under high security access, and any background or origins will be left out. This should keep you safe, and prevent the possibility of anyone getting a hold of the paperwork figuring out who you are. There will be enough speculation as it is. What do I tell people? Minato raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. Nothing. Naruto blinked. Okay, how is he supposed to tell people nothing? He was going to have to really watch his mouth. He wasn't used to that sort of exercise in restraint. He sighed. At least he had learned to control his emotions most of the time. He figured he would be able to extend that sort of control to his words as well. If it comes down to it, we'll put something together. Minato said. Alright, what is your rank? Minato asked. Genin. Naruto said, officially. I've been taking a class mission since I was 13, though. Well, Naruto chuckled and raised his hand to adjust the knot of his forehead protector. Well, it's more like the missions end up as a class, really. Genin? Minato said. Naruto shrugged. Yeah, my first Chunin exam got interrupted with an invasion, and I never had the time or desire to try again. It didn't matter. My rank didn't stop Tsunade Obasan, 4, from giving me high-ranked missions, or putting me on teams of Chunin or Jonin. Though, that might have had to do with the nature of the missions. Minato said, how so? Most missions I took on were kind of personal, or were a direct result of someone coming after me, or I going after them. Minato's eyebrow rose again and he shook his head. I'm going to put you down as a Chunin, though I'll test your skills when your health is back up to par. Tomorrow, Naruto said. I'm pretty much set now if I needed to be, but tomorrow will be about perfect. Gives me time to eat and all. Minato looked amused, but nodded all the same. Tomorrow then. Naruto looked back up at his father and sighed. What happened? He asked, seeing a mixture of emotions flicker through the fourth's eyes. Minato glanced out the window for a moment before looking back at him. The Uchiha is dead, he said. Naruto nodded, feeling relief at the confirmation. It isn't officially known to the village that he was an Uchiha, but the rumor is strong enough to cause a stir. The Uchiha clan especially. Naruto scowled slightly at the thought but didn't say anything. No doubt the elite Uchihas were demanding the body to keep their precious Sharingan to themselves. He wondered if the fourth gave it to them, or if he disposed of Madara's body himself. Naruto wasn't sure which would be better. If the Uchiha clan knew Madara's face, then maybe one of them wouldn't trust him enough to accept teaching from him. He was too torn on the thought of the Uchiha clan anyways. Part of him wanted to save them from their future slaughter and a part of him hoped that they would be killed if just to get rid of that annoying bloodline limit. Naruto sighed and shook his head. It didn't matter, not yet. What about Kushina? He asked quietly. He remembered Madara's threat that he had been too late. Kushina is fine, Minato said, his voice thick with some emotion. But, Naruto looked up at him a bit fearfully, curling his fingers into a fist to try to contain his emotions. She miscarried, Minato said softly. Naruto felt his eyes widen, his body frozen at the words. What? The child was stillborn, Minato said. He didn't survive the attack. Kushina barely did. She only left the hospital 2 days ago. Naruto couldn't speak. He could barely think. His eyes lost focus as he tried to process what he had been told. Kushina was still alive. Madara was dead, but the baby had died. Naruto's young, infant self had died in childbirth. He had died. Naruto sucked in a shaky breath, looking down at his own body to make sure he was still there and alive. How was it possible that he as a baby had died, but he was still there? Naruto shook his head, pulling air into his lungs and forcing himself to breathe. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide. Minato looked torn between sorrow and concern and something else entirely that Naruto couldn't identify at all. Naruto shook his head again and opened his mouth to try to speak but nothing came out. He let his head fall to hang between his shoulders, staring at the floor between his feet. He felt Minato move to stand near him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Naruto shuddered at the contact then stilled, thankful for the man's support and presence as his mind whirled. Madara had killed the unborn Uzumaki Naruto. 2 weeks after arrival, Naruto walked through the streets of Konoha, taking in the subtle changes that he could notice in the buildings and shops around him. It was largely the same. Konoha had a certain atmosphere to it that Naruto had always thought to be steady and unchangeable. A rhythm that seeped through the taped and bandaged structures of the hidden village. It was home, no matter the year or time. Naruto pushed the red fabric of his coat aside and stuffed his hands into his pant pockets. The knee-length coat was a new addition to his wardrobe. It bore the swirled icon on the sleeves and back, and had a thick bar of black around its base. He had rolled its sleeves up past his elbows, bearing the sleeves of the dull navy shirt he wore under the collarless flak vest. Kushina had presented it to him, the red color different from what he normally wore, but he would never refuse her. She was his mother, even if she didn't yet know it. He treasured the gift. Kushina had visited him at Minato's side, her face a bit strained and her movements slow, but her smile had been bright and real. Naruto knew that the past couple weeks had been hard for the two. They had lost a child. Even though Naruto was that same child from some now impossible future, they had lost a child. Naruto had no idea how to relate, and so kept his distance, letting them come to him if they wanted to, no matter his on-again off-again desire to get to know them. Naruto didn't know how to react to either of his parents anyways. Minato was easier. Naruto could see him as the yondaime and half ignore the father role, but Naruto was generally left a bit confused the few times he had seen them so far. Naruto approached a yellow apartment building and unlocked the door, making his way inside and up the 2 flights of stairs. He knew the building. Kakashi had lived in it during his time as his sensei, though Naruto had yet to meet him in the past. Minato had informed him that Kakashi had joined Anbu some months ago and that it would be unlikely to run into him much. This had been said with both pride and a mischievous smirk that Naruto recognized immediately as the prequel to something devious and likely directed at whoever the smirk was pointed towards, which at the time had been Naruto. Naruto had yet to figure out what plot his father was forming against him. Naruto unlocked and entered his apartment, bypassing the booby-trapped light switch by the door and shuffling into the small space. It was large enough to hold a kitchen area and a living room combined, though it left it feeling a little crowded. His bedroom and bathroom were off to the side through a door. Overall, it was larger than the one he had used as a child, and a bit nicer. A monthly stipend pay from the Hokage would allow such a thing. Naruto was hoping he would be able to start missions relatively soon and take over his own expenses. Kinatsu-san. A voice floated over from the windows. Naruto glanced in the direction out of the corner of his eyes, spotting the half-hidden form of a shinobi perched on the ledge outside the window. He was young, likely a chunin serving in the Hokage's tower. He had seen him a couple times before but didn't know the man, though that wasn't unusual. "Careful," Naruto said, pointing to the ceiling tags along the edge of the window, "don't set them off." The shinobi's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the tags booby-trapping the window near his head. "Hi, Kinatsu-san. Thanks for telling me." Naruto shrugged and turned to look at him fully. "Need something?" Hi, Hokage-sama has requested your presence in his office," the man said. Naruto nodded and the shinobi gave one last uneasy look at the tags near him before dropping out of the window to the street below. Naruto sighed and looked around his apartment before following, jumping out the window rather than making his way back down the stairs and through the doors. It was just easier to use the window, shock tags or not. He scaled the outside of the Hokage tower and climbed through the glass doors of the balcony outside the Hokage's office. Minato was seated at his desk, with 2 others in the room with him. Naruto looked at the 2 in mild surprise, recognizing the third seated in a chair to the side of the desk. Naruto glanced to the side, spotting Jiraiya leaning against the wall. "You could use the door, you know," Minato said with a scowl. Naruto grinned sheepishly at him, even though it was hidden by his scarf, and entered the room. "Yeah, but the window is faster and you're kinda fun to antagonize." Minato growled at him, which caused Naruto to stare at him for a minute before grinning widely. He had always thought his penchant for growling had been from the fox, but apparently it ran in the family a bit. Granted, Naruto's growls tended to sound distinctly feral and animalistic, while Minato still sounded perfectly human, but the habit was still the same. Minato sighed and gestured to the other 2 men, both of whom were watching Naruto with open curiosity. Naruto eyed them in return, noticing the speculation and hesitation in their expressions. Naruto raised an eyebrow at his father. "You told them?" he asked, watching the growing smile on Minato's face. "Only what I knew," he said. "I've asked you here to fill in a few gaps." Naruto nodded and reached up to pull the scarf off his nose, letting it pool around his neck. The 2 men inspected his face curiously. Naruto knew now how much he looked like his father. Despite the faint whisker lines on his cheeks from the Kyuubi's influence, it was rather unmistakable that the 2 were closely related. "Release the hackinkage," Minato said. Naruto pulled in a breath and formed a seal with one hand at his side, feeling his chakras swirl and settle. He let out the breath he had been holding, feeling the subtle effects of the release of the bloodline limit. He knew that his eyes had returned to their summer blue color, the same shade of blue as his father's eyes. "You look a lot alike," Jiraiya commented. "What's with the eye color?" "It's the mark of the Namikaze Kekkai Genkei," Minato said. "It doesn't affect the sight of the ninja, but the activation of the bloodline limit changes the eye color to gold." "What does it do exactly?" The Jiraiya asked. You've spoken of it, but never fully explained it to me. Kinatsu? Minato said, turning to him. Naruto shrugged and nodded. The complete hackinkage affects your strength, speed and stamina. Naruto said. In combination it increases healing ability a little, but that's more of a side effect, at least for me. Tsunade Ban wasn't sure, but she thought that it might be specific to me cause of the fox. Something about my chakra being able to increase my healing rate, and the hackinkage increasing the flow of my chakra or something. Anyways, there are different levels of the activation that increase the effects as the level goes up. Of course, the higher the level activated, the more chakra it sucks up. It has been many decades since I have seen an activated hackinkage. The third said. To what level have you awoken yours? Just the first, Naruto said. I have all three aspects of the bloodline limit and I can activate the first level. At the first level, it simply enhances my natural abilities something like 30%, or so Kakashi-sensei guessed. I'm not sure how much the increase will be at the next level. I'm working on the second level, but it's taking me a while, and I've been distracted from my training what with crazy missing nin coming after me and all. Impressive, Minato said with a proud smile. Naruto grinned at him, pleased and slightly ecstatic to see the pride in his father's eyes. He didn't bother to reactivate, he had wanted it for the extra healing after his fights with Madara, but he didn't like to rely on it on a day-to-day basis. He didn't need to, and it really did put a drain on his chakra levels if it was activated for days on end. And he no longer had the Kyuubi's seemingly endless chakra supply to feed his own. It was going to take him a while to get used to that. Alright, Kinatsu, Minato said, tell us. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the three. Of all the ninjas he had come to know, these three were some of those he trusted the most. There were others, Tsunade, Kakashi, Sakura, Gaara, but Naruto trusted and looked up to these three. He had called one sensei for years, and had gone through his childhood relishing the attention of the third all the while staring up at the visage of the fourth and vowing to surpass him. So he told them, not a lot, but enough. Naruto skipped over his childhood and glossed over his days as a genin, mentioning Sasuke and Orochimaru if simply because they stood out in his head so much. But Naruto focused his story on Akatsuki and more importantly, Uchiha Madara, the man who had jumped through time in order to get rid of him before he became such a nuisance to the organization. They listened silently and didn't ask him a single question. Naruto wasn't sure what the men's silence meant, but he continued his half-halting tale anyways, finally settling into a sort of rhythm in the telling that was reminiscent of when he reported after completing a mission. He focused on the facts and left out most of the personal stuff of his life. By the time he was done, finishing with his suicidal, desperate ploy of pulling on Kyuubi's sixth tail in order to face down Madara, Naruto was feeling a little exhausted. He hadn't had to tell the story in full, well, ever. Those around him usually knew most of it. He hadn't realized how tiring it would be to relate the story of the last few years of his life. And he had left out so much. That's quite a story, Minato said softly, his fingers crossed under his chin. Naruto sighed and sat himself on the floor in front of the desk cross-legged, leaning his head on his hand. Minato followed him with his eyes, one of his eyebrows raised in a sign of amusement that Naruto was fast becoming familiar with. You don't know the half of it. Naruto grumbled, and it was true. I'm sure I don't. The fourth said. How old are you now? The third asked. 18, Naruto said. So the Kyuubi is no longer sealed inside you? Jiraiya asked. Naruto shook his head. I have no idea why, or what happened or how. Shit, I don't even know why I survived the damned fox's extraction if it was even that. Gaara sure hadn't, but the Kyuubi is gone. Completely. The seal is dead, and a damned black hole has been left in my brain the size of the Hokage mountain. It scarred you, Minato said a bit tightly. Naruto sighed and nodded. The seal is still there, he said, glancing down at his own stomach, but it's barren, inactive, and there's no trace of the stupid fox in my system anywhere. Not even residual chakra floating around in some corner somewhere. I mean, I could have missed something, but I don't think so. It would have shown itself when I got so pissed off at Madara anyways. You had claws, Minato pointed out. Naruto blinked and looked down at his hands. His nails were a bit more claw-like than normal for a human, but they had been like that for years. Really, Naruto was a little surprised that there wasn't more physical markers of the Kyuubi's presence on him. An interesting side effect perhaps. The third said. It makes some sense, considering it has affected your physiology in other areas. Naruto nodded. I would get the slitted, red eyes and glowing chakra fox shroud deal, but only when I got too angry. The three were silent for a while as Naruto stared at his hands and pondered his new, subtle physical changes. Nay, did my eyes turn red? He asked, looking back up to his father. When I was fighting Madara. No. Then I'm pretty sure the Kyuubi is gone. Naruto said. Maybe because he was sealed in me for 18 years I got some physical side effects. I've always had these, he said, pointing to his cheeks, and over the years I developed some of the others, like my teeth and nails. But the fox isn't in me anymore. No fiery chakra. No bitchy fox spirit growling crudeness at the world. No endless pit of rage and fury burning in the back of my head. Gone. Naruto tilted his head to the side slightly, finally really thinking about the sudden absence of his lifelong tenant. It's kinda strange, actually. Interesting, Jiraiya said. I wouldn't mind taking a look at that seal sometime. Naruto nodded. Sure, why did Orochimaru want Uchiha Sasuke so badly? Minato asked, changing the subject a bit and throwing Naruto off guard. Huh? Why Sasuke? Why not one of the other Uchihas? Naruto blinked at him before it hit him. Itachi hadn't killed the clan yet. Because Sasuke was the last. All three of their eyes widened a bit at that. The last? Minato asked. Itachi murdered the entire clan when Sasuke was a kid. He only left Sasuke alive. Itachi joined the Akatsuki. Sasuke killed him later, but they were both labeled as missing nins by that point. Naruto left out the bit about Sasuke taking his brother's place among the Akatsuki and attacking Konoha. Things were crazy enough without mentioning that. Actually, Naruto preferred not to talk about a lot of things that happened, or would happen. There was a twisted reason for it all that you probably don't really want to know. Naruto said. Itachi's hands killed the clan, but he had help and he was, Well, like I said, you probably really don't want to know. The three gave him a variety of looks but Naruto refused to elaborate. He wasn't ready to tell them that Itachi had destroyed one of Konoha's greatest clans on the order of his own council, no matter the reason. Naruto thought about the Uchihas, and wondered if he could, or even wanted to, change things. He would have to think about it. Minato heaved a sigh, shaking his head slightly. I suppose you are stuck here, then. The fourth said after a minute. Unless you know how to get me back. Naruto said, looking up at the man in a mixture of hope and fear. He wanted to get back to his friends, but he knew what awaited him. He wasn't sure he was ready to face those challenges yet. He wasn't strong enough yet, even with the Kyuubi's sixth tail, he couldn't beat Madara, and he no longer had the Kyuubi's power anymore. Only with the fourth's speed and strength were they able to kill a severely weakened Uchiha Madara. And there was still one more out there with the Kyuubi still under his control. Minato shook his head. My time and space techniques do not focus on such long-range time manipulations. Naruto sighed into his hand. Alright, trying to settle into the idea of his situation. He was in his own past and was stuck there, unless this time's Madara felt inclined to take him back, but Naruto kind of doubted that. What about Madara? Naruto asked. What about him? Jiraiya asked. He's dead. The one from the future is. Naruto said. This time's Madara is still out there and collecting the tailed beasts. He still has the Kyuubi since it didn't finish its attack and get sealed. Naruto quieted at that, remembering that his younger self had died, stillborn by Madara's attack on Kushina. Even if the Kyuubi had continued its attack, the Kyuubi would not have been sealed inside the baby body of Uzumaki Naruto. Things were different, already very different. Naruto wondered how much more things would change. He couldn't predict the future, he realized, even though he had lived it. Let me worry about Madara. The fourth said. Naruto raised his eyebrows but didn't question him. The fourth was one of, if not the, strongest shinobi of Konoha. Naruto knew that, and was comforted by it. Hey, alright, Naruto said, shifting his legs so that one was propped up for his chin to rest on. Akatsuki should already be formed by now. Orochimaru will be joining it soon if he hasn't already. He already has. Jiraiya said. Last year. I don't know how many of the tailed beasts they have yet, but they'll be collecting them for the next decade. They didn't go after Gaara until I was 16, and they never got their hands on me, however much they tried. Gaara? The third asked. Oh, yay. Naruto said, smiling a bit. Gaara of the Sand. He's the youngest of the Kage's children in Sanagakure. He has the one-tailed Shukaku inside of him. Oh? The third said. I knew Suna had the Shukaku, but not that the host had been changed. Naruto shrugged. So, kiddo, Jiraiya said, a smirk growing on his face. Got any more good stories to tell? Naruto grinned. I've a few good ones about you, Arrow Sennin, one. But I don't think you would want me to tell them in front of your sensei and student. Naruto smirked as Jiraiya's eyes flickered over to the other two men before narrowing on Naruto, a clear warning to watch what he said. Naruto chuckled. Like your books. Have you started writing them yet? I never asked when the first one came out in print. Icha, right, Arrow Sennin. Jiraiya's eyes widened in surprise, telling Naruto that the man had at least started to write, even if he wasn't publishing the books yet. His smirk grew. How's your research coming along? Naruto asked, his smirk nearly devious now. None of your business, brat. Jiraiya said, sniffing and looking away with crossed arms. Naruto laughed at the sight. He had missed the man severely over the years. It was good to pick on him again, to see the quick changes of emotion and attitude that reminded him so much of himself. Minato cleared his throat, getting their attention. He was clearly amused, and if Naruto had to guess, likely knew what sort of research Jiraiya was up to. Kinatsu, Minato said, his face serious though his eyes were still amused. I am sending you with Jiraiya. You'll leave in a week and I'm sending some mission scrolls along with for you to complete while you're gone. What for? Naruto asked, getting to his feet. Jiraiya is keeping an eye on Orochimaru and Akatsuki. Minato said, I want you to go with him because you are the only one who has dealt with them to any extent. And I'm going to train you. Jiraiya said, you already did that. Naruto grinned. I get to do it again, huh? This should be fun. What are you going to teach me, Arrow Sennin? That depends on what you know. Naruto tilted his head to the side, grinning at them. I know the Rasengan. He got the surprised look out of all three of them again, though Minato's was less pronounced. I've also added an elemental recomposition to it. Naruto said with a smirk, and developed it into 3 separate advanced attacks. You? Minato stopped, his eyes wide now. You added an elemental recomposition to the Rasengan? Naruto nodded. Yup. Kakashi-sensei helped me. He taught you the Rasengan? Minato asked. No. Jiraiya did that when I was 13. Naruto said, pointing to the white-haired ninja. Kakashi-sensei taught me about elemental recomposition and then I had to add the two together on my own. Minato sighed and leaned back in his chair, chuckling lightly. Naruto, son, you are full of surprises. Naruto grinned widely at his father. You want to see it? The next day Naruto made his way to the training grounds, looking around the familiar area. It was the same training ground he had been in when he had taken Kakashi's bell tests. It even still had the 3 posts stuck in the center of the clearing. It was nice to know that some things didn't change. Kinatsu. Minato called from his position leaning on one of the posts. Heya. Naruto called out in greeting, waving one hand as he jogged to join the small group waiting for him. Kinatsu, let me introduce you. Minato said with a smile, gesturing to the 2-3 Chunin-dressed ninja beside him. These are Saotome Tetsu, Shiranui Genma and Hitaki Kakashi. Naruto looked them over, trying not to stare at the younger Kakashi. Naruto didn't know Tetsu. She had her dark auburn hair pulled to the back of her head, her bangs fanned out around her face and half obstructing the leaf Hite-8 wrapped around her forehead. Her pants had been cut to shorts, and she wore guards over her shins and arms. Genma and Kakashi, Naruto had known before. They were both, like Tetsu, dressed in the standard Chunin outfit, though without the modifications. Genma had a senbon between his teeth and was grinning at him, while Kakashi watched him silently from behind his half-mask. Naruto rather thought that Kakashi didn't look much different. He even still had his Hite-8 covering one of his eyes. Guys, Minato said, this is a friend of mine, Kinatsu. Hiya, Naruto said, waving his hand at them again. Friend of the Hokage, Tetsu said, grinning at him. Hey, Tetsu. Genma said, try not to scare him off. Hey. Tetsu said, what are you saying? That I'm scary? Yes. Genma said with a smirk. Tetsu growled at him, her fist clenched at her sides. You're not supposed to fight with each other, you know. Minato commented. The two shot him looks and Naruto grinned. Hey, why are they here? Naruto asked, looking the three over with a critical eye. They are going to spar with you. Minato said, so we can test your skills a bit more officially. Naruto looked at them again. These three? Oi, what are you implying? Tetsu said. I'm stronger than you are. Naruto said, crossing his arms over his chest and looking down his nose at her. He was taller, not by a lot, but still taller than her. I'll use you for a pincushion. Don't you think you being buddy-buddy to the Hokage will save your ass? You'll have to catch me first, Tetsu-chan. Naruto said with a leering grin, I'm pretty fast. Tetsu cocked her fist and swung. Naruto ducked and dodged out of her immediate reach, though he needn't have bothered. Minato had caught her wrist before her fist would have reached him. Tetsu stood glaring at Naruto, not bothering to share her death glare with the one holding her back. Naruto stuck his tongue out at her. You're dead, Carrot Top. She ground out, a kunai in her free hand suddenly. Tetsu, calm down, Minato said. Kinatsu, quit antagonizing her. HMPH. Naruto kept half an eye on the kunoichi, not too sure about her. She seemed a bit bloodthirsty to him, though considerably less crazy about it than Anko had been. So why are they here, then? Naruto asked, aren't they a bit young? Kinatsu. Minato said sternly. Naruto shut his mouth and scowled but didn't say anything else. As I said, the fourth continued, they are here to spar against you. Naruto looked the three over again but held his tongue. Minato sighed. You told me that you had not gained Chunin. Naruto shrugged. Yay, but I still took A-rank missions. So? They may be younger than you, Minato said. But they are Chunin, and Kakashi is a Jonin. Naruto looked the three over, not bothering to say anything and trying to size them all up. He didn't know Tetsu, but she reminded him of Mitarashi Anko an awful lot. He only knew Genma in passing, but he knew Kakashi very well. Naruto sniffed and nodded a couple times. Yeah, I'll take them all on, he announced, crossing his arms over his chest and nodded again at the fourth. He caught sight of Kakashi's narrowed eye and the glower from the two Chunin. Minato stared at him for a minute before laughing and shaking his head, still holding Tetsu's wrist as she tried to attack him again. You little pipsqueak, she hollered at him, you bastard. I'll gut you myself. Hey, Naruto said, pointing at her, aren't ninjas supposed to be able to control their emotions? What's up with you? And you're a Chunin. Ah, she yelled, and chucked the kunai in her hand at him. Naruto dodged it, glancing back as it struck the ground behind him, buried to the hilt. Tetsu, Minato said, though he was still smiling. The girl stopped her struggling but she glared at Naruto, her eyes narrowed dangerously. Naruto watched her warily and kept his silence, having flashbacks to his Chunin exam, and the first time that Anko had thrown a kunai at him. He was wondering if the two were related. Minato sighed. Kinatsu, this is a team sparring match. He said, holding up a hand to forestall whatever Naruto was about to say. You'll join Genma to make a two-man team against Tetsu and Kakashi. What? Naruto said, looking at the three again. They're stronger than they may look. Minato said, raising his eyebrow at him in amusement. Fine. Naruto said, narrowing his eyes at Kakashi. Kakashi simply looked at him blankly, his one uncovered eye watching him closely. Genma's face was more expressive, but it still didn't tell him much about the guy. Yes, Naruto said, psyching himself up. It had been a while since he got the chance to spar with Kakashi, after all. Let's go. Say start already. You better watch yourself, shithead. Tetsu said, grinning a bit manically at him, you're mine. Naruto waved his hand nonchalantly as he joined Genma to face off against the other two. Genma rolled the senbon in his mouth around, grinning at their opponents. Tetsu growled at him, but didn't say anything. Naruto stood next to Genma and sized the two across from him up. Of all of them, Naruto was probably the eldest, though Genma had to be near his age. He thought it a bit odd that Kakashi and Tetsu, the obvious younger ones, were placed on a team together. Neither could have been more than 14 or 15. Then again, Minato had said that Kakashi was already a Jonin. Don't use anything that'll seriously hurt anyone, Minato said to them. This is simply meant to judge your levels, not kill each other. Ah, how am I supposed to show you what I can do then? Naruto asked. Minato gave him a look and Naruto grinned in response. You don't need to show off in order to prove that you can be a chunin. Minato said. Being a chunin isn't about high-powered jutsus, too. Yeah, Naruto said. Whatever. Can we start now? Minato sighed and nodded. Naruto grinned and threw a few shuriken at the two. They dodged, Tetsu ducking under them and retaliating in kind. Naruto jumped over the low throw, and caught sight of a few more coming at his head in the air. Naruto's grin widened as he formed a familiar hand seal. Shadow clone, he said, and a clone appeared beside him, pulling him out of the shuriken's path. Hey, Minato's slightly exasperated voice floated over to him. I didn't say start yet. Naruto ignored him, grinning as his clone landed first and Naruto used it as a springboard and launched himself straight at his two opponents, a kunai in his hand. Tetsu's eyes widened slightly at his attack, and dodged, swinging her leg around to connect solidly to his ribs as he passed over her. Naruto landed awkwardly, but charged at Kakashi, ignoring Tetsu's sprawled form on the ground behind him. Kakashi had a kunai in his hand already. Naruto lunged and was blocked, their blades sparking as they connected. Kakashi aimed a kick for his gut and Naruto blocked it but was sent skidding backwards, giving the other boy time to pull a short sword from his back into his hands. Naruto eyed the blade, having been unaware that Kakashi used a ninjutsu. Kakashi charged during his hesitation, and Naruto jumped over him, somersaulting over his head and aiming a kick to the boy's back. Kakashi dodged but took the kick in his shoulder, spinning him slightly at the force of it. Naruto landed and struck under the boy's guard, a kunai clutched between his hands and aiming for the ribs. Kakashi's blade swept his kunai away from its aim, and tore it from Naruto's grip. Naruto cocked his fist and swung up at his chin, forcing the other boy backwards to avoid the uppercut. A kunai sliced through the air between them, forcing them apart. Naruto jumped backwards and looked to the direction it had come from, spotting Tetsu smirking at him. He glanced beyond her and found Genma circling behind her, his eyes on Kakashi. I told you you were mine, Tetsu said, pulling another kunai from her bag. Yeah, Naruto said, forming a cross-hand seal. Shadow clone, he called out, looking behind him to see his dozen clones, all shaking their fists and taunting the dark-haired girl. I'm all yours, Tetsu-chan. Naruto called out brightly, grinning at her widely as the clones rushed at her. Tetsu's eyes widened slightly at the clones before narrowing as she fell into a ready stance, kunai in each hand. Naruto turned his attention back to Kakashi, but frowned as he found the other boy going against Genma, their weapons clanging against each other. His clone's memories filtered into his brain and Naruto looked back at Tetsu, watching with some surprise as she dispatched the clones with a wild, deadly precision. Hey, he called towards her, standing far enough back to be able to dodge should she attack him. You're pretty good, you're dead, she hollered back, gutting one of his clones viscously. Naruto winced as the clone's memory absorbed into his brain. She wasn't very nice with her killing thrusts. You'll have to find me first, Tetsu-chan, he said cheerily, forming hand seals. Multiple shadow clone. The army of Naruto's grinned as the small clearing was nearly overwhelmed with 100 clones. The others had all paused in their fighting, staring around them in shock at the small army. One of the clones perched on top of the post that the fourth was still leaning against, looking down at the man with a crooked grin. Hey, the Naruto clone said, waving at the man, why don't you come and join in? I don't think they can handle it without some help. Minato's eyes narrowed slightly at the clone before flipping a kunai up at it. The Naruto clone vanished in a puff of smoke, prompting a few of the others nearby to look at the man warily. Naruto eyed his father for a minute, trying to decide if the man was going to join in the fray or not before shrugging and turning his attention to the fights. His clones were overwhelming Tetsu, though the girls certainly dispatched many of them. The scene was a bit funny to watch as the Narutos hollered and yelled and taunted before disappearing in a puff of smoke from Tetsu's blades or foot. Genma was scowling at the army, and had cut through a few of the clones himself in order to continue his duel with Kakashi, who now had a large shuriken twirling around his hand in a spinning blade that he aimed at any Naruto that got close enough. Naruto had the brief thought that this young version of Kakashi was reminding him an awful lot of Sasuke. Fire release. Fire ring defense. Tetsu's voice called out from the middle of the army. Naruto, from his relatively safe position behind the fourth and the posts, watched as a ring of fire flared out from her and decimated a good portion of his clone army, leaving a dissipating cloud of smoke in its wake. Tetsu stood at the center of the cleared space, glaring around her at the surprised clones in a manner that promised death and likely a lot of pain along with it. The Naruto clones all glanced at each other before charging at her, shuriken in hand. The Narutos jumped into the air, all of them calling out in unison as they threw the blades at Tetsu. Shuriken from all directions. Tetsu's eyes widened at the rain of throwing stars. The shuriken struck her with dull thunks, and a log was revealed in her place, peppered with the weapons. The Naruto clones looked around for her, spreading out a bit to find her. Naruto found her just in time to see her hands flash through a set of seals. Lightning release, electric bolt. She called out from her crouched position on a tree branch. A bolt of lightning shot out from her hands, striking the nearest clone and branching out to hit more. The clones scattered, some of them having the mind to throw a kunai or shuriken at the girl in the tree before they were struck by the lightning attack and puffed out. Tetsu followed her lightning with a strong kick to one of the clones' throat, and spinning to stab a second in the chest with a kunai. The Naruto clones recovered from the shock of her attack and began to retaliate, though Tetsu was dispatching them with a fierce ease, growling whenever one got close enough to land a hit on her. After a minute the remaining clones gave the girl some space, watching her carefully. Tetsu was breathing a bit heavily, and scowling at the clones circling her. Naruto, the original Naruto, jumped up on top of one of the posts and looked at the devastation that Tetsu had wrought of his clone army. Naruto made a face in her direction. She had gotten rid of a lot of his clones, and he didn't have a lot left in the clearing. He glanced at the other two, finding that Kakashi and Genma had moved their weapons battle into the tree line, just out of his sight. The occasional flash of a jutsu lit up the trees. Naruto grinned and returned his attention to Tetsu. Naruto jumped off of his perch to join in the fun, saluting his father as he jumped over the other man's head. Minato followed his progress with his eyes, one of his eyebrows raised in amusement. Naruto landed, grinning as he formed hand seals and ran towards Tetsu. His clones saw him coming and moved around him, disguising his approach. Wind release, wild wind attack, Naruto said, throwing his hands at Tetsu as he broke through his circle of clones. Tetsu spun at his voice, her eyes narrowed as she threw a kunai at him. Naruto stopped and grinned as his jutsu flew at her, barely visible. The wind spun wildly, almost out of control, pulling the kunai off its course and flinging it through the air. The wind attack continued towards Tetsu, who dodged out of its way to the side. She didn't dodge quite far enough though, as the edges of the wind whipped at her clothes and hair, picking up dirt and grass and leaves and spinning them through the air in a wild dance. Some of clones got caught in its path, popping out as the wind reached them and pummeled the debris it had picked up at them. Naruto watched as the attack died down and Tetsu pushed herself to her feet. He hadn't put a lot of chakra into it, and tried to generally dull it down. The first time he had used the attack he had leveled the area in front of him, leaving a wildly decimated small forest in ruins. Well, he had been a bit desperate and highly frustrated at the time. Naruto watched as Tetsu regained her footing, looking a bit hassled. She glared at him, her eyes narrowed to slits and her fist clenched at her sides. Naruto watched her back, well aware that she was putting up a nice little fight. A crash and yell interrupted their standoff, and Naruto looked behind him to see Genma fly through the tree branches and skid to a crouched stop in the clearing. He had gained a gash across the top of his arm. Kakashi followed him into the clearing, his sword poised to stab along the length of his chest. Naruto watched them clash again, their weapons sparking before they jumped backwards from each other. They both looked a little out of breath, though Kakashi was hiding it a little better. Naruto wondered why he didn't have his Sharingan uncovered. Naruto waved at some of the clones around him, and they grinned as they raced off to annoy the two boys still fighting. Naruto turned his own grin back to the girl and threw a shuriken at the ground in front of her feet to catch her attention again. "You're starting to piss me off, bastard," she growled, waving a fist at him. Hey, Naruto said, "It took you this long?" Tetsu growled at him wordlessly. Naruto grinned. "Your teammate is getting beat," Naruto said, pointing over his shoulder at the other two boys and ignoring the fact that Genma was obviously starting to struggle against Kakashi. It's just you and me, now. Hey, you're easy, Tetsu said, pulling a kunai from her belt pouch and settling into a ready stance. Naruto put his hands up behind his head, chuckling as his few clones nearby imitated his pose. Tetsu charged at him, and Naruto jumped out of her way, pulling a kunai from his bag. Tetsu changed directions quickly and stabbed at him. Naruto blocked her blade, but took her sudden sweeping strike full on. Her foot crashed into his chest, sending him flying backwards. He rolled once and skidded to stop crouched on one knee. Tetsu followed after him closely, throwing shuriken at him. Naruto jumped over them and struck out with a quick double kick, flipping over as his second foot connected with her forearm. He landed and dodged in under her guard, digging his fist into her gut. She coughed and spluttered, bending over as she tried to catch her breath. Naruto took the opportunity to grab one of her wrists and twist it around behind her back and pushed her down to the ground. Naruto planted one of his feet on her back, and held her still as she struggled under his foot. "Ah," she growled, "I'll kill you." "Ah, Tetsu-chan," Naruto said with a wide grin. "You're—" Naruto's eyes widened as Tetsu's body disappeared in a cloud and was replaced with a log. He jumped back from it and spun around, looking for where she disappeared to again. Her displacement techniques were a bit annoying. A sharp edge touched his neck and Naruto stilled, feeling her closeness to his back. "You little bastard," Tetsu said in his ear, "you're not that good." "Heh, heh," Naruto said, holding his hands up in surrender. "Good one, Tetsu-chan." Naruto felt the kunai's edge press closer to his neck and he smirked. "But not good enough," he said and disappeared in a cloud, leaving Tetsu to swear at the dispersed clone. "Where are you, you little shit?" she snarled, looking around her. "Here," Naruto said, "Earth release, suicide decapitation." Tetsu's eyes widened as her ankle was grabbed and she was pulled down into the ground suddenly. The rock and dirt closed in around her, pinning her limbs uselessly and leaving only her head above the ground. Naruto grinned brightly at her, crouched in front of her head. "Ah, Tetsu-chan," he said, "you almost got me there." "I'll gut you," she snarled at him. Naruto chuckled and rubbed his hand through his hair. She was a little intense, really. Naruto looked around and found Kakashi holding his sword to Genma's neck with the other boy sprawled on the ground below him. "Hey," Naruto called to his father, who was still in his spot against the posts. "It's your turn." Minato raised one eyebrow at him but didn't move. Naruto jumped to his feet, dispersing the few clones left and waved at the other blonde. Hey, are you gonna get out here and do something or not?" Minato shook his head. "Alright, nice job guys." Naruto grinned and walked away from Tetsu, who glared after him, still stuck in the ground. Kakashi and Genma joined Minato at the posts. "Hey you little bastard," Tetsu called after him, "let me out of here." Naruto didn't bother to look back at her and just waved his arm over his head. "Hey, Kiroi Ani, 3. Naruto called, catching Minato's attention. "You too old to fight anymore or what?" Minato watched him for a moment and Naruto smirked at him from his spot halfway between him and Tetsu. Naruto had a kunai in his hand and was twirling it around his finger, trying to goad the fourth into displaying some of his skill. Naruto was hoping to be able to let loose some more of his skills than he could against the others. He wasn't always used to holding his strength back. He was used to going up against strong opponents that he had struggled against a bit. Sparring with a group of teenagers while entertaining wasn't what he was used to. Sparring with the fourth Hokage could prove a great challenge. Naruto grinned widely at him. "Come on old man," he called again. Minato smiled and Naruto blinked at the growing smirk on the other man's face. "Oh," he thought, "this might be difficult." Naruto wondered about his brain's slowness in recognizing that fact. The fourth was heralded as one of the best ninja of Konoha and Naruto had just challenged the man. Naruto remembered the few times he did the same thing to Jiraiya, only to get a good thump on his head for his trouble. "Very well," Minato said slowly, reaching his hand into the tool pouch on his belt. Minato threw a kunai into the air, its arch on a loose path to land somewhere near where Naruto stood. Naruto watched it in the air for a second, noticing the odd, three-pronged blade. "Kunai shadow clone," Minato said calmly. Naruto's eyes widened as the single, three-pronged kunai multiplied into 100 in the air. Naruto dodged the incoming rain a bit frantically, though none of them actually struck him. Naruto glanced around at the clearing littered with the kunai and then looked back to his father. Minato still stood leaning against the post, smirking at him deviously. Naruto watched him a bit warily, not sure what the kunai rain had been for. Minato suddenly vanished and Naruto took a step backward, just in time to feel a blow connect with the side of his head and send him flying across the field in the growing black of unconsciousness. Naruto woke to a bright light in front of his eyes and a headache. What happened? You got a first-hand display of why the Hokage is called the Yellow Flash, little bastard. Naruto cracked one eye open to see Tetsu leaning over him, her face cracked in a grin. Naruto groaned. Ow! He heard laughter around him and he finally managed to sit upright and take in the group. Genma was kneeling next to him, with Kakashi nearby. Minato was standing behind them with a small, satisfied smirk on his face. Naruto snarled silently at him. You better teach me that jutsu, Kiroi Ani, Naruto said, waving a fist at him, or you'll regret it. He just leveled you in one strike, and you're threatening him? Genma asked. You're crazier than I thought. Naruto crossed his arms over his chest and scowled at his father. He got a lucky hit. Lucky hit my ass, Tetsu said, straightening up. He's not Hokage for nothing. Naruto was in his apartment, hunched over his kitchen table with scrolls and slips of parchment laid out before him when his stomach's growling interrupted his task. He ignored his stomach as his hand painted the last of the characters for the explosive tag, the thin brush scratching across the surface of the thin slip of paper. He finished the seal and leaned back, tracing the characters with his eyes carefully to make sure he hadn't made a mistake. Even with the simple seal characters of an explosive tag, a careless mistake could cause a world of hurt. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Naruto laid the brush down by the inkwells and placed the newly created tag on the pile of complete tags nearby. It was a good start for a collection, and if he had the time, he could create enough of them to sell a few bundles, since he was yet to be cleared for active missions. While the fourth was willing to put him on active duty, the council members apparently were being the same stick-up-the-ass bastards that they always were. They hadn't liked him much on the one brief occasion that he had the displeasure of meeting them all again. His appearance from out of nowhere did not help his case, and his blunt way of speaking just ticked them off, and he had happily done so. The scarf around his face didn't help his case either. Their continued stubbornness had put off his planned mission with Jiraiya by 2 weeks already, so the Toad Hermit had left 3 days ago without him. Information on Akatsuki's movements and his spy network was more important than getting Naruto out of the village. Naruto knew and fully accepted it, but it didn't make him any happier about being left behind. He scowled and got to his feet, leaving his seal materials scattered across the table, and plotting through a variety of humiliating pranks that he could play on the council. He hated being grounded to inactive status. It had happened on more than one occasion since he made Genin, and it chaffed every time. The council never did trust him, or like him. The only thing worse is being trailed by an Anbu squad that doesn't think I know they're there. He thought darkly. His stomach rumbled again and Naruto moved towards the door, deciding that he wanted Ichiraku's ramen, and it had been far too long since he had been to the miracle of a food stand. He hadn't yet visited it since his impromptu arrival in the past and his mouth was watering at the mere thought. He strapped on his sandals and pushed his scarf over his nose and left the apartment, locking his door behind him. With thoughts of a good meal of ramen soothing his irritation at being caged within the village, Naruto made his way down the hallway, bypassing a neighbor and her daughter who looked vaguely familiar. Neither of them gave him more than a glance as they passed, engrossed in their own conversation. Naruto paused after he had passed them and looked back, recognizing the older woman, but not the teenage daughter. They had stopped outside of a door 2 down from his own, their conversation floating down the hallway. He watched them for a minute, trying to figure out where he had seen the woman before. The daughter, perhaps 14 or 15, was dressed in a new Chunin vest, talking excitedly about a C-ranked mission she had just returned from. Her story alternated between barely contained pride at a job well done, and complaining darkly about one of her teammates. Her mother smiled at her story and scowled at her complaints and Naruto suddenly recognized her. He sucked in a breath and turned away, walking down the stairs and out of the apartment building as his mind swirled with old memories. He remembered the woman as being one of the villagers who had always greeted him with nothing more than a distant scowl, darkness in their eyes and hatred lacing their sense. He didn't know her name and she had never spoken to him nor come close to touching him, but he knew her face, and he knew that she had lost a daughter during the attack of the Kyuubi, a newly crowned chunin who had been one of the many teams and ninjas to attempt to battle against the destruction that was the nine-tailed fox. He didn't know if the girl had died while trying to directly fight the fox or if she had been one of the many victims of the destruction that waved over the forest and edges of the village from the fox's long-range attacks. He thought the latter, but it wasn't like the woman would have told him anyways. Naruto paused on the street outside the apartment and glanced back up at the four-story building. He was somewhat torn with his feelings. On one hand, he resented the woman for her dark looks and severe indifference to him as a child, but another part of him was glad for her, happy that her daughter was still alive and well. He wondered how many others were still alive who had died the first time, and he wondered how much those lives would change the future. He sighed and turned away, making his way down the street towards the general direction of his favorite ramen stand. The young, new chunin was not the only change and difference that he had noticed. It was the little things that got to him, really. The village was Konoha, yet not. There were things that he would suddenly notice that just seemed off or wrong to what he expected, and they threw him off every time. The different location for the ninja academy, the absence of Iruka-sensei within the academy once he found it. He hadn't realized how much he had expected to see Iruka-sensei in his classroom until he wasn't there. The plethora of Uchiha, which was one of the odder things, seeing so many of the clan wandering the streets with a range of scowls and severe looks on their faces. Then there was the semi-recognizable faces that just looked too young, too different. People he had met and knew somehow before, but they no longer knew him, or looked at him in different ways. Naruto stopped in front of Ichiraku's, absently taking in the sight of the place before blinking rapidly and staring at the stall in front of him. A wrinkled, frail-looking old woman sat hunched over in the back of the stall, a needle in her hand as she slowly but surely stitched at the material in her lap. Naruto looked around him, wondering if he had somehow managed to go to the wrong location, but the establishments on either side of him were what they were supposed to be. He looked back at the seamstress and her little stall filled with cloth and thread and needles and stared. "Where's Ichiraku's?" He watched the old lady, not really seeing her as his mind floundered. This was the right location, it was the right street. The dango shop was to the left and the old man's convenience store was behind him, and he could just make out the top of the Hokage tower over the corner of the stall's roof, and the angle was just right as to block out the lower half of the third's face carved into the mountain from view. Just as it was supposed to, but there was no Ichiraku's ramen. Naruto sucked in a deep breath and looked down the length of the street, still not really seeing anything in front of him. His emotions swirled and his chakras spiked for a moment, and he heard the seamstress gasp. He glanced back at her and saw that she had poked her finger with her needle. Naruto stared at her from his increasingly slouched posture, barely blinking, and trying to will his favorite place to eat back into existence. How can there not be Ichiraku's? He thought, where'd it go? He let out a low keening noise in his throat, and with one last look at the confused and slightly nervous seamstress he wandered off back down the road listlessly. His eyes jumped back and forth, wondering if the missing ramen stand had set itself up somewhere else. But he didn't find the familiar red flags and enticing smells of Ichiraku's. Not along that street, nor any of the others he paced down throughout the following 2 hours. Finally giving it up, he let his feet carry him where they wanted, bemoaning the loss of ramen and thinking that of all the things that he had found to be different, the missing Ichiraku's ramen stand was by far the worst. The third found him slouched in his favorite thinking space, hidden among the spikes of the fourth's hair atop the Hokage mountain. It was one of the few of his spots that were still around, and arguably the best of the lot. It was quiet save for the birds in the trees behind him, and rarely did another person pass nearby. He was hidden from view, and left alone to think without interruption. The best part, Naruto found, was that the village stretched out below him looked like he thought it should. Naruto sighed and slouched lower among the rocky spikes of hair, fighting off depression and righteous indignation. He had wandered the streets for most of the afternoon, backtracking and pacing as he looked for the familiar ramen stand that he had visited at least 3 times a week, usually 7, sometimes more than once a day since he had been 5. Konoha just wasn't Konoha as it should be without Ichiraku's. His stomach rumbled at the thought of the missing ramen stand and he scowled, caught up somewhere between annoyance, depression and homesickness. And he had barely been in the past for 3 weeks yet. That's quite a face. Naruto's scowl deepened as he turned his head to look at the other man, disgruntled at being found. The third stood just off the carved part of the monument, lined up to about the only space that could see Naruto's position among the spikes from the backside of the mountain. Naruto gave him a small smile. "Hey old man, what do you want?" Naruto said, his voice neutral and slightly teasing. The third frowned but made his way forward anyways. Naruto watched him, thinking that it was strange to see the man without the Hokage's robes and hat. It was the only outfit that Naruto ever really remembered seeing him in growing up. Sarutobi wore clothing that resembled that of the elder council members, but he stood strong and was clearly a well-trained shinobi. Naruto could see the solid footing, the easy glide of his movements, the way his eyes took in everything around him, cataloging. There was no doubt that the old man, despite his age and dress, was every bit the incredible ninja of his reputation. Naruto thought it a little odd that he didn't seem quite as old or frail as Naruto remembered him to be. By the time he had made Genin III had simply appeared to be a strong shinobi clearly past his prime. Old strength had lingered beneath the surface, but it had felt almost stale in comparison to other active ninja. The Sarutobi in front of him now did not have that stale feeling of strength. The man was still clearly a dangerously strong man. Naruto wondered if the change had been gradual or sudden in the first timeline. Not many have the audacity sit on top of the heads of the Hokages. The third commented with some amusement. Naruto looked up at him and snorted, turning back to look out over the village. That's why it's such a good spot. Nobody would think to come to look here. Besides, there's no law that says I can't be up here. No, there isn't, Sarutobi said, crouching down to sit next to him. It is one of those unspoken rules, I suppose. Naruto made a disgruntled noise in his throat but didn't voice his thoughts on the matter. He had never cared for many of the laws and rules that had been flung at him. He listened to them only long enough to know that they existed for him to break them. It was always more fun to break a rule when he knew he was doing it. However, he had learned about most of the village's many unspoken rules by breaking them unknowingly. "How are you doing, Kinatsu?" the third asked. Naruto glanced over at him, taking in the benign look of concern on the man's face. He remembered the many times that he had found comfort in the old man's presence as a child, happy and content to have some attention that wasn't hateful or full of scorn. The third had always been around to give him a kind word or touch, usually just when Naruto needed it the most. "I'm alright," Naruto said, looking back to the village. He sighed, "It's different. Harder than I thought it'd be, I guess, not that I really thought about it." "Ah." Sarutobi pulled out his pipe and lit it. Naruto watched absently, comforted by the familiar scent of the tobacco and smoke that wafted around their heads and slowly faded into the wind. Naruto leaned back against one of the rocky spikes of hair and pulled the scarf from his face, letting it pool around his neck. He was more used to its presence, but it still somewhat bothered him. He was very much not used to hiding his face. He had never done so before, even though he knew the whisker scars on his cheeks marked him for what he was to so many. He flaunted them, even when he didn't know what they meant, because he craved the attention, no matter what sort it was, and because it was one of the few ways he could show the village that he wasn't scared of them. "What bothers you, Kinatsu-kun?" the third asked, his voice soft next to him. Naruto sighed, being reminded of how observant the old man was of people's moods. "You always knew when I was down," Naruto said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Oh?" Naruto nodded. "Even though I smiled and laughed and joked, you still knew." Sarutobi puffed a thick ring of smoke over them. "And did I usually figure out the reasons?" "No." Naruto smirked at him. "Not always. At least I didn't always voice it, but I think you figured things out on your own just fine most of the time." The third gave him a pointed, if comforting look before turning his eyes to gaze out over the village. Naruto smiled and followed his gaze, settled into the silence and comfort of the man's presence. They were quiet for a while, both watching the comings and goings of the villagers below them. Shinobi leapt from rooftop to rooftop, civilians wandered the streets. Naruto spotted a youth attempt to wall climb with chakra, only to crash down to the alley, much to his companion's clear amusement. A normal day in Konoha. Yet Naruto still felt the subtle, barely there differences that marked this Konoha as not his Konoha. "It's just not the same," Naruto said. "What isn't, Konoha?" "Ah, no, I suppose it wouldn't be." Naruto scowled down at the village, sorting through his emotions and feelings, trying to pinpoint why he felt so lost and confused. Part of it was the village, he knew, but the rest of it was something else and he had no idea how to address it. Naruto started, paused and sighed heavily. It's Kushina, he said, pulling one knee up to rest his chin on. He scowled, it's not that I don't. I mean she, hell. I don't know. Naruto sucked in a deep breath and buried the lower half of his face in the crook of his elbow over his knee. She's your mother, Sarutobi said. Naruto nodded. Yeah, but she doesn't even know. Yes, but she has just recently lost her firstborn to a violent attack. She's a ninja, a very good one, yet even shinobis struggle with the loss of a loved one, especially of a child. Naruto nodded again. But it's not just that the baby, It's not just that he died, I don't even know. The third puffed on his pipe in silence, looking at the blonde next to him with an unreadable expression. Naruto scowled down at the village, trying to sort out exactly what he was feeling so depressed and confused about. It wasn't just homesickness. It wasn't just the differences, the whole being in the past fiasco, though it certainly didn't help his turbulent moods. Whatever his discomfort was, it stemmed around Kushina and to a slightly lesser extent Minato. Naruto stubbornly ignored whatever feelings he had about his missing Kyuubi, stuffing them down deep below his emotions about his parents and the time travel and being stuck in his situation. He didn't want to address the hole that the Kyuubi's absence left in him just yet. I think it's because they're my parents, Naruto said softly. He let out a long, low breath. I've never had them before. Sarutobi shifted next to him. I see. Naruto glanced at him, a little exasperated. Well, could you clue me in? 'Cause I'm not seeing anything. I don't get it. Sarutobi chuckled. Tell me, Kinatsu, was there one who filled the role of a parent for you when you were a child? Naruto blinked. I guess. Iruka-sensei maybe. But he was more like an older brother, really. I would say Jiraiya, but that's just a little wrong. He's too perverted to be a father. Sarutobi laughed, and Naruto smiled at the sound. A minute later Naruto sobered. I guess the answer would be, no, then. Minato and Kushina do not have children. Naruto blinked, a bit confused at the statement. He felt a momentary flash of irritation considering that they would have a child if not for Madara, but forced it aside. He knew that the old man wasn't trying to be mean, and was only trying to get Naruto to think along some other line of reasoning. Naruto, however, didn't have a clue as to what that was. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, squinting at the man beside him. Sarutobi smiled a bit. They do not know how to be parents, Kinatsu, just as you do not know how to be a son. Naruto blinked again and sat up straighter as his words sunk in. Well, that might explain it. Naruto and Minato both knew of their real relationship to each other, and despite the joy of that, neither of them really knew how to act when together. Naruto found it easier to ignore the fact that the man was his father and just concentrate on him being the Yondaime Hokage, his superior, village leader and occasional sparring partner. During the few times that Naruto couldn't shake the father aspect of their relationship out of his head, he found himself feeling a bit awkward and nervous, rare emotions if he ever had any, and falling behind one of his many masks while he edged away from the other blonde, looking for distance in order to settle his emotions. Naruto wasn't usually one to avoid an issue, but he was simply at a complete loss for how to handle his relationship with Namikaze Minato. He didn't even want to get started on his turbulent reactions to Kushina. It was easier to avoid her. Naruto let out a breath and rested his head back against the rock. So, now what? Sarutobi made a noncommittal noise and sucked at his pipe. That is up to you. How'd I act around them? And that was the real question. Naruto could handle the subtle differences of the village. He could handle the strangely young familiar faces that no longer recognized him. He could even handle, with much work and disgruntled swearing, the lack of Ichiraku's ramen, but he had no idea how to handle having parents. He had never had anyone to serve as anything even similar to him. The closest anyone had ever come was Iruka, who was more of a brother, or Jiraiya, who was by far more like a perverted old godfather, more interested in peeping than fathering. Naruto supposed that Kakashi as his sensei could count as someone close, but Kakashi was, well, that just didn't fit either. Sarutobi laid a hand on his arm and Naruto looked over at him. Just be yourself, Naruto. The third said, "The rest will fall into place on its own." Naruto stared at him for a minute and smiled. "Yeah," he said, turning back to look at the village. "Thanks, old man. Anytime, anytime." Naruto grinned, finding endless amusement in the turn of phrase. Sarutobi chuckled next to him as they lapsed into a comfortable companionship. Naruto felt better, even though he was still craving ramen, and he was pretty sure that he would still crane his neck around corners looking for old friends every time he thought he heard an almost familiar voice. He would always miss his Konoha, but he also knew that the Konoha below him was still Konoha, even if it was different in minute ways that he couldn't always pinpoint. But for all the differences and the loss and the surreal feelings, Naruto recognized the potential that his situation gave to him. He could make things better for his future friends, and give them lives that were better than they had been the first time around. Naruto was wandering towards the training fields, intent on working on figuring out the limits of his endurance without the Kyuubi when he was waylaid. He smelled them first, a vaguely recognizable scent that told him they were of Konoha, but before he could identify them further a kunai shot out of the trees to his feet. He jumped backwards as the kunai struck the ground, sinking deep into the earth. Naruto eyed it for a moment and followed its trajectory back into the trees. 3 ninjas stood across from him and he recognized 2 of them, Genma, who was leaning against a tree, and Tetsu, who stood in the branches above him. He didn't know the third, a young boy with dark hair and eyes and a cool face who stood half in the shadows of the woods. He was dressed in the usual Chunin uniform minus the vest, which had been replaced with a short-sleeved, wide-collared navy shirt. He couldn't have been older than 11 or 12. He looked a lot like Sasuke had as a child. Naruto rather thought that the 3 of them made for an odd team. There was a wide range of ages and seemingly personalities between them. He wondered who the kid was. "Hey, shithead," Tetsu called, twirling a second kunai around her finger. "Ah, Tetsu-chan," Naruto said with a wide grin, which could be seen despite the scarf wrapped over his face. "Did you miss me, you little twerp? Quite calling me that," she growled. Naruto just smiled wider and waved at them, not bothering to tell her again that he was actually older and bigger than she was. It didn't seem to matter to her. "Asu, 1, Genma," Naruto said. "Kinatsu," Genma smiled, "if you aren't careful, she's going to gut you or something." Naruto shrugged, ignoring the slight roll of malice coming off the younger girl, and nodded towards the boy standing in the speckled shade of the trees. "Who's the Gaki, too?" Genma glanced behind him at the Uchiha look-alike. The kid frowned at being called a brat, but didn't respond otherwise. "He's our new teammate," Genma said. "Uchiha Shisui." "And Uchiha, huh?" Naruto said, studying the boy. He could definitely see the resemblance to both of the Uchihas he had known, but Shisui also looked a bit different. His hair wasn't as dark a black, having lighter almost reddish highlights in the sunlight, and he was taller than Sasuke had been. Shisui had longer limbs and it looked like he would be a gangly teen. Naruto guessed that he would be taller than both Sasuke or Itachi had ever been. "Heard of them, have you?" Tetsu said. Naruto nodded and pulled his eyes away from the boy to wink at the girl in the tree. "Who hasn't?" Tetsu snarled silently at him and gripped the kunai she had been twirling in her hand. Naruto only kept half an eye on her. She was quick, but his reflexes were quicker. She was still just a Chunin, and the ninja war had ended before she fought in it. She probably hadn't seen much of real combat yet, and Naruto knew that he had a huge edge on her. He was more interested in what the Uchiha boy could do. He had heard the stories. The Uchiha clan was one of the best of Konoha. They called themselves elite. Naruto had heard the term more than once from Sasuke and Itachi both, though the two said it in different ways. Sasuke still bore pride for his clan, Itachi only held scorn for its reputation. Naruto figured that either way there was something to all the rumors. If an 11-year-old Uchiha was already a Chunin, then he had some talent to get him there. "Is the Gaki any good?" Naruto asked, looking back at the Uchiha to watch the boy's reaction. Shisui's frown deepened and his eyes flashed slightly, not with the Sharingan, but with angry indignation. Naruto would recognize anger anywhere in any form. The Kyuubi was a roiling mass of anger and fury and madness. Naruto knew it well. "Probably better than you, shithead." Tetsu ground out. "Better than you, Tetsu-chan?" Naruto asked, flashing a grin at her again. Tetsu crouched lower on her branch, her knuckles a bit white around her kunai at the reminder of their past spar and her loss. "You got lucky," Tetsu said. "You're not that good." Naruto bit his tongue to prevent himself from saying something that would make her try to kill him. He didn't mind a good fight every once in a while, but he didn't want some Chunin trying to lop off his head because he goaded her too far. "I didn't want to hurt you, Tetsu-chan," Naruto said, grinning behind his scarf at her. Then again, he was terribly bored and highly frustrated with his grounded status. Maybe a pissed-off Chunin with a bad attitude and the urge to kill him was just what he needed to blow off some steam. Tetsu made a sound between a snarl and a shout and chucked her kunai at him. Naruto sidestepped it easily and jumped back from her launched attack. Tetsu flew past him, rolling over the ground and coming to her feet in a mostly fluid movement. Naruto turned sideways to watch her and keep an eye on her two teammates. He wasn't sure that they wouldn't join in to help her out or not. "You're so angry, Tetsu-chan," Naruto commented. "You're pig-headed, twerp. I'll remind you that I'm bigger than you are. Your ego maybe," Tetsu said as she came at him. "And that doesn't change that you're a shithead." Naruto dodged her punch to his face and moved around her, pushing on her shoulder to move her off balance in the process. She caught herself before she stumbled and growled lowly as she spun low and swiped her foot at his legs. Naruto jumped over her leg and backwards out of her immediate range, tossing a shuriken in front of her to make her redirect whatever attack she had planned. Tetsu paused, crouched in a ready position with one side facing forward towards him. "You barely know me and already you don't like me," Naruto said. "I'm impressed. That should tell you something about yourself, how quickly people dislike you." Naruto shrugged. "I'm used to it, I'm afraid." "Come on, Tetsu," Genma called, "as much fun as it is watching you two bicker, we've got to get a move on." Tetsu straightened and frowned at her teammates. Naruto just stood aside and watched them, curious about what they had to be doing, and a little disappointed at their thwarted fight. "Going on a mission?" he asked. Genma nodded. "A quick one to the border. Delivery and message mission. Heard you were grounded," Tetsu said, turning back to him with a smirk. Naruto shrugged again, scowling. "The council didn't like me much," he said. "They don't trust you, you mean?" Tetsu said. "Is there a difference with them?" Tetsu barked out a laugh and she moved to leave, waving at her teammates to follow her. Genma moved from his lean against the tree, his senbon shifting from one side of his mouth to the other. Naruto could see Shisui out of the corner of his eye. The boy was watching him closely, in a way that reminded Naruto of how Itachi used to watch him, interested, reluctant, aloof, as if trying to see if Naruto had the possibility of potential for some plan or power. It had made Naruto uncomfortable with Itachi, and it was equally uncomfortable with the young Shisui. "You hear about the Jonin trials, Kinatsu?" Genma asked. Naruto shook his head. "Are they like the Chunin exams?" "Nope," Genma said, his smirk showing around the needle between his lips. "They're worse," Tetsu called back to him. Naruto turned to look at her as she walked away, leaving her teammates behind. Naruto looked back at Genma, trying to ignore Shisui's stare. "What are they?" "They're not an exam," Genma said. "More like a chance for the Chunins to beat the hell out of each other and then have the chance to go up against some of the Jonin." "The Jonin participate?" Naruto asked. "They always do. So it's what, a competition?" "Something like that," Genma said, rocking his hand side to side. "Except no Chunin ever wins it. The Jonin always beat the best to a pulp by the end." "Sounds like fun." Genma gave him a strange look but then grinned. "Yay, it does, nay? It's coming up then?" Naruto asked. Genma nodded. "Yup, at the end of the week I think." "You're not sure?" "No Chunin ever is. It's a surprise tournament. We haven't had one in a few years because of the war, but there has been rumors for a couple months now that we'll be having one. It'll be soon." Naruto stuffed his hands into his pant pockets and rocked back on his heels. A tournament-style fight amongst the Chunin and Jonin sounded like a better way to work out his frustrations than baiting Tetsu. It would also give him a chance to see what the current crop of Chunin and Jonin were capable of. He knew a lot of them from his future, but they weren't quite the same yet. He knew that from the spar with Tetsu, Genma and Kakashi. Kakashi could have taken them all on when Naruto had known him, and the young, masked Jonin had struggled a bit, not much, but it was enough for Naruto to notice. "How do you get in?" Naruto asked, causing Genma to smirk. "You're sponsored," Genma said. "A Jonin submits your name if they think you're worth the effort." I don't think you'll have to worry about it. It's supposed to be a surprise, being sponsored by some Jonin, but I bet that you'll be in it. I don't know many Jonin, Naruto said. He actually knew a lot of them, they just didn't know him at all. He had mostly kept to himself in the weeks he had been in Konoha, training alone or occasionally with the fourth. You know the Hokage, Genma said, slapping him on the shoulder. Naruto felt himself stiffen slightly at the contact, but Genma just smiled and walked away. Naruto watched him for a moment. Genma joined Shisui at the edge of the training grounds and the two disappeared from his view. Tetsu was already gone. Naruto turned back to the training fields and thought about the Jonin trials. It would be a good way to see what his new limits were. Without the Kyuubi as backup, Naruto really didn't know what he was truly capable of anymore. He could still create 100 shadow clones without breaking a sweat. He was pretty sure he could do it more than once in succession, but he just wasn't sure. Working in the training fields alone was different for him than facing an opponent. He always did better when the pressure was on. Naruto grinned beneath his scarf and headed deeper into the training fields. Naruto panted as he stood hunched over, his hands on his knees. Before him was a stretch of downed trees and shrubs and upturned earth that made the area look as if a tornado had gouged out a part of the forest. It stretched before him in a twisted, deadened manner, the trees not just knocked down or uprooted, but broken and twisted around themselves. The only sound was his deep breathing as he tried to catch his breath. The local wildlife had long ago fled the area, leaving him alone in the training field. Damn it, that hurt, he grumbled. Nay, boss, we almost had it that time. Naruto looked up at his clones and nodded. 3 of his clones stood near him, looking a little worse for wear. We didn't quite get it, did we? Naruto asked. All 3 of his clones shook their heads, their eyes flickering over the downed trees nearby. Naruto ran a hand through his bangs and tugged the scarf around his face off, letting it pool around his neck. All right, he said, standing straight. One more time. One of his clones held its right hand out, palm up, and he and another clone circled around him. The Rasengan, 3, formed over the upturned palm easily, the blue chakra spinning above the clone's hand with a whisper of wind. His clones flanked him, as they reaching out to manipulate the chakra. The sphere changed under their direction, first growing in size and then spinning faster as elemental reconstruction was added. White wind spun sharply around it, chased by streams of red fire as the Rasengan grew and changed. Got it, his clone yelled just before a silent boom echoed off of the trees. Naruto's hair was pushed off his face, and his clothing whipped around him as a force of unseen chakra rippled out from the sphere in the clone's hand, pulsing through his body and rattling the trees. Naruto looked down at the jutsu, the blue, white and red colors of it racing around the sphere. Blue was at its center in a tightly condensed sphere of chakra with razor blades of white wind twirling in a steady circle around its middle. Chasing the blades of wind was the fire, licking around and through the sphere in a wild, untamed manner. It was a deadly-looking technique, and it lived up to its look. At least he thought it would. All right, Naruto said, watching the sphere carefully. Try to hold it. The clone began to run, his hand holding the Rasengan arched at his side, aiming for the already devastated stretch of forest in front of them. The chakra in his hand whistled at the motion, the wind whipping behind the sphere like a comet as the clone charged forward. The Naruto clone reached forward, pushing the sphere in front of him, and the whistling sound grew louder. Hurricane Rasengan, the clone called out. The chakra connected, whistling loudly, and for a moment everything seemed to still. Then the Rasengan exploded. Naruto staggered and threw up his arms to block the blast of air and dust, lowering his head to ride out the aftershock of the explosion. Wind howled before him, blocking out the sounds of cracking trees and burning foliage. He cracked an eye open, watching as his technique ripped through the forest again, rising high above the trees and spreading out in a wild spiraling pattern of destruction. Blue, white and red chakra laced through the area, feeding off each other and fighting for dominance. Fire trailing wind, wind gusting and blowing out fire, both fed by the whirlpool of blue chakra as the tightly knit center of the Hurricane Rasengan expanded out and forward. The destruction raged and blew forward, dying slowly with a trailing sound of wind and crackling flames. Naruto lowered his arms, taking in the additional damage with wide-eyed shock. The trees were gone, not just cracked and broken and shredded, but gone. A triangle gouge of earth and stone stood where once there had been a stretch of tall forest trees. It stretched before him like a gaping canyon, as if some great beast had tracked its claws deep into the earth and uprooted it all. Along the edges were shredded bits of trees, roots and branches reaching desperately into the hole left behind by his attack. His clone stood at the head of the swath of destruction. Naruto walked over to it, taking in the worn state of it, clutching its arm close to its chest. The clone's clothing was worn and its sleeve tattered, revealing the raw skin of its arm. Blood tried to leak out of the pores, collecting and streaming down the arm to drip slowly to the ground. Naruto heaved a sigh. "That's going to hurt, isn't it?" he asked, thinking of the memories he'd get once the clone poofed into smoke. The clone winced and nodded, holding its arm carefully. Naruto glanced between the destroyed, downed forest and the clone. His clones usually didn't survive the attack, dissipating before the full power of the Hurricane Rasengan was unleashed, unable to survive long enough to hold it to completion. He wasn't yet desperate enough to hold the attack himself. It was adding 2 elemental reconstructions instead of the one of the Rasen Shuriken. His Rasen Shuriken was self-damaging, and he had known from his clone's continued dissipation that his attempt at this new attack would be just as destructive to his own body, if not more so. He had been right. The clone's arm was trembling in its grasp, seeping blood out of pores, and the skin looked raw and thin. He had never seen the full power of that attack before. "Damn," Naruto mumbled, still shocked at the sheer destruction that his technique carried. He was quite sure that nothing would have survived it had anything been in its way. He felt a flicker of pride and directly after that a deep satisfaction. He had completed another variation of the Rasengan, one that would rearrange the landscape if he needed it to. He smirked. It also let him work out a good deal of his frustrations and wild emotions from his situation and being in the past. Nothing like beating the hell out of something to make you feel better. "We did it, boss," his clone said, its voice strained a bit as it continued to hold its injured arm. The blood was increasing, and the clone's arm was an angry red mixed with pale white skin. Its face was looking a little paler than it should, too. "Yeah," Naruto nodded, "and I'm not sure if I'll ever want to actually use the thing." "Damn, it's destructive. Hurts too," the clone grumbled. Naruto nodded again and then stilled, squeezing his eyes shut as a wave of dizziness swept over him. "Whoa, eats chakra like a bitch, too," Naruto said and let his body slip to the ground, holding his head with one hand as he fought off the dizzy feeling. He moaned and hung his head between his knees, ignoring the chuckles from his injured clone above him. He hadn't felt such a level of chakra exhaustion in a long time. The Kyuubi's absence made his pool of chakra no longer so deep. It was a strange, empty feeling that yawned open in his gut in a way he wasn't sure he could ever fill short of putting the fox back in it. "Company, boss," his clone said suddenly. "Leave me alone," Naruto said, pulling the scarf from his neck and pulling it over his head in an effort to drown out the dim light coming through the trees above him. It was hurting his head. "Fine, boss. I'll take this one, then." Naruto ignored his clone, but froze when he heard a girl's voice call out across the small clearing. "Kinatsu." He knew that voice. "Kushina-san," his clone greeted. Naruto heard the clone's feet shuffle across the ground, rounding a downed tree to meet the woman. Naruto peeked out from under his scarf, spotting his clone, its scarf wrapped around its face, and Kushina through the brush and trees. He was largely out of sight from them, sitting behind the downed tree and in the semi-shadow of the forest, or what was left standing of it near the edge of the clearing and the cleared gully he had just created. "Kinatsu, training?" Kushina asked. The clone replied with an affirmative and was about to say something else when the woman spotted his injured arm. "You're hurt," Kushina said, reaching out to the clone. The Naruto clone reacted with unfeigned nervousness and avoidance, stating that it wasn't something to worry about, which it would have been had the injury been on the real Naruto. Kushina didn't seem happy with the situation, looking equally concerned, annoyed and protective. Naruto was touched by her concern, even though she didn't need to be, but she didn't know that she was talking to a clone with more endurance than was usually healthy for the thing. Naruto watched them interact for a minute, drinking in the sight of her. She had donned personal ninja dress, her slacks tucked into the wraps around her calves and her feet bare in her sandals with her hitei tied around her neck. An orange tank over a slim, navy shirt draped her shoulders and fell to her mid-thighs, decorated with white patterns of some leaf or flower down one side, interrupted only by the belt of her tool pouch. Her long red hair had been pulled back into two loose braids that trailed down her back and shifted every time she moved. "What have you been doing?" Kushina said, reaching for the injured clone. "Did you do this training?" "Hey, sorta," the clone said. "Sorta? What do you mean sort of? Were you sparring? Did someone else do this?" "No, well not really." The clone tried to take a step back, but Kushina wrapped a hand around its upper arm, keeping the masked blonde in place. "What happened, Kinatsu?" Kushina said, her eyes narrowed in determination. Naruto grimaced slightly before standing and sliding further into the shadows away from the two. He moved silently, letting his scarf fall back around his shoulders as he picked up his red coat from near his feet, and moved deeper into the trees. His clone could handle this. He was too tired to do it himself. Besides, he thought, I'm not really injured anyways. He was just out of hearing distance of the two when his clone's memories filtered into his mind, telling him that the clone had dissipated itself. Naruto paused in his slinking through the shadows as the memory of the pain of the jutsu rippled through him, and then grimaced as the end of the clone's conversation with Kushina came to him. Her grip on his shoulder, the healing chakra laced through her fingers as she reached for his injured arm, and the streak of panic the clone had right before dissipating away. Kushina's shocked face the last thread of memory. "Damn it," he mumbled, glancing back the way he had come. She wasn't going to be very happy with him for the panicked ditching and getting away from her healing, nor for tricking her with a clone. "Kinatsu." Her voice echoed angrily through the trees, reminding him very strongly of Sakura when he had done something stupid to piss her off. He vaguely heard her move through the forest, no doubt looking for the real him. Naruto grimaced again and jumped up into the trees. Maybe he'd avoid her for a while.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.